Tonight, we're diving into a quieter version of a vast and famous story, a telling in which the boy who was meant to become a messiah simply never did, and lived instead an ordinary human life beneath the same enormous desert sky. Imagine Paul Atreides without prophecy, without the terrible visions, without the weight of being the chosen one, a capable young man and nothing more, walking the sands of Arrakis as himself alone. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters, we will follow him without haste through an ordinary boyhood, through a fall survived by simply enduring it, through a life among the Fremen earned by hand and deed rather than by legend, and through the strange, gentle mercy of a future that never caught fire. You do not need to remember any of it. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you softly down toward sleep. Chapter 1. A Boy Without a Prophecy on the Ocean World of Caladan. Where the sea folds against the black cliffs in slow and endless breathing, there lived a boy named Paul Atreides. He was the son of a duke, born into an ancient house with its hawk and its banners and its long history of loyalty and loss. But before he was any of those things, before the weight of names and worlds came anywhere near him, he was simply a boy. And it is as a boy that we begin, gently, in the quiet hours, when the world grows soft and sleep draws near. He was bright, this boy, in the ordinary way that clever children are bright. He asked questions that his tutors could not always answer. He remembered the shapes of things he had seen only once. He learned quickly, and he learned well, and those who trained him nodded to one another with the small, satisfied pride of teachers who have been given good clay to shape. Yet there was nothing in him that reached beyond the edges of a human life. No visions troubled his sleep. No sense of destiny pressed against the inside of his chest. When Paul dreamed, he dreamed the way all children dream, of small things and half things, of the sea and of running and of faces he loved. And in the morning, the dreams slipped away like water through open fingers, leaving nothing behind but the ordinary warmth of having slept. This is the tale we are telling tonight, and it is a tale unlike the one the universe expected. For in another shape of things, in another turning of the great slow wheel, this same boy would have become something vast and terrible and shining. He would have carried oceans of time behind his eyes. He would have seen every path a life might take, and every death and every consequence spreading outward across the stars like ripples across still water. Whole legends waited for him. In that other shape of things, prophecies aged like wine in the deep cellars of distant faiths, ready to be poured out the moment he arrived. But not here. Not in this telling. Here the prophecies keep sleeping in their old jars, undisturbed, and the boy grows up as boys have always grown, one plain day at a time. And that is the whole soft heart of the story. Consider how strange and how peaceful that truly is. Somewhere in the machinery of fate, a single small thing turned differently, quietly, without thunder or sign. And because of that one small turning, Paul Atreides would never wake in the night gasping at futures he could not stop. He would never feel the crush of a billion possible lives laid across his own. He would carry only his own life, the single thread of it, unknown ahead of him and gentle behind him, exactly as you and I carry ours. There is a mercy in that which the boy himself would never fully understand, because he would never know what he had been spared. He would simply live, and being spared would feel to him like nothing at all. It would feel like an ordinary evening. It would feel like this one, His mother watched him with a love that was deep and steady, and, in this telling, wonderfully untroubled. She was a woman of great training and great discipline, schooled in an old order whose purposes ran longer than empires, and once she had carried within herself a purpose she was meant to serve. But that purpose had come to nothing. Softly, the way a candle goes out when no hand is near to guard the flame. And so she loved her son not as an instrument of some ancient design, not as a step upon a ladder reaching toward a promised one, but simply as her child, the boy she had carried and borne and rocked to sleep. When she looked at him, she saw a face, not a fate. When she held him, she felt a small, warm, ordinary weight, and nothing more, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. His father, the Duke, was a man burdened by many cares, for a great house is a heavy thing to carry, and there were always enemies in the corners of the galaxy plotting against him. Yet when he came to his son, he set those cares down at the door, the way a tired traveler sets down a pack. He taught the boy about honor, about the difference between ruling and owning, about the loyalty a leader owes to those who follow him, which is greater, he believed, than the loyalty they owe in return. And Paul listened and took it in and grew straighter for the taking. These were not the lessons of a Messiah. They were the lessons a good father gives a good son, worn smooth by 1,000 generations of fathers and sons before them, and they settled into the boy like rain into soil. He trained too, as the sons of great houses train. There were men who taught him the blade, and the older art of the body, and the quiet, unsleeping habit of caution that keeps a noble alive in a treacherous age. He was quick with all of it, quicker than most, gifted in the plain human way that some children simply are gifted. But he was not more than gifted. When he fought as a talented young man fights, with skill and nerve and the ordinary limits of muscle and breath. No stranger power moved his hands. No borrowed certainty told him where a blow would fall before it fell. He won often, and lost sometimes, and bruised like anyone. And the bruises faded, and he trained again the next day. And that steady plain rhythm of effort and rest was the whole engine of his growing. And in the evenings, when the training was done and the great house grew hushed, the boy would go to the high windows and watch the sea. The waters of Caledon are gray and green and silver by turns, and they move without ceasing, and there is a peace in watching them that asks nothing of the watcher. Paul would stand there and let his thoughts drift out over the waves, and his thoughts were small and near and his own. What he might eat, what he might learn tomorrow, whether the storms would come early this year, the face of someone kind. He did not see the deserts of a distant world waiting for him. He did not see armies or thrones or the green banners of a faith that would one day carry his name across 1,000 worlds and drown them in blood. He saw only the sea, and the sea saw only a boy, and between them there passed nothing but the quiet. There were nights, of course, when the storms came in hard off the water, and the old house shuddered under the wind, and the boy would wake in the dark and lie still and listen. But even then, no fear reached very deep into him, for he knew the walls were thick and the people who loved him were near, and after a little while, the listening would soften back into sleep. In another shape of things, those wakeful nights might have been filled with terrible sights pressing up from behind his eyes. But here the dark held nothing but the dark, and the storm was only a storm, and the boy slept through it as boys have always slept, and woke to a washed and shining world with the whole ordeal already forgotten. Let us leave him there a while, at the window, in the last soft light of an ordinary day. There is no hurry in this story. That is perhaps its greatest gift to you tonight, that there is nothing urgent in it, nothing that must be seized or feared or hurried toward. A boy stands at a window and watches the sea, and he is loved, and he is safe, and he does not know he is anything but ordinary. And he is right. He is only a boy. He will only ever be a man. And in the whole wide indifferent turning of the stars, that will turn out to be a kind of grace, the kind so gentle that it never once announces itself, the kind that simply lets a life be a life. Up next in Chapter 2, the Bene Gesserit design undone, we'll drift back to the quiet unmaking of an ancient plan and see how a purpose older than kingdoms let go of a single child and slept. Chapter 2, the Bene Gesserit design undone. Far from the Sea of Caladan, older than the memory of most living things, there ran a plan. It was not written in any single book, nor kept in any single hand. It lived instead in the patient minds of an order of women, a sisterhood schooled across the long centuries in the arts of observation, of persuasion, of the body and the breath, and the deep control of the self. They called themselves by a name that meant, in an old tongue, something like the ones who work in shadow, and shadow was indeed their country. They moved quietly through the courts of the great houses, advising, watching, marrying where they were told to marry, and bearing children where they were told to bear them, and always, always, they were counting. For the plan that ran beneath all their smaller plans was a breeding plan, vast and slow, reaching back thousands of years, and meant to reach forward a little longer still. Bloodline was married to bloodline, gift folded into gift, each generation chosen with the care of a gardener grafting one rare branch onto another, and all of it bent toward a single distant flower they had never yet seen bloom. They were trying to bring forth a person, not a king, not a general, not a saint, but something the human race had not yet held, a mind that could look in the two directions the sisterhood themselves could not, a mind that could stand in the place where memory and prophecy meet and be unbroken by it. They had a name for this person, held close and rarely spoken, and the name meant the shortening of the way. Tonight we tell of how that plan, so old and so careful, came quietly to nothing. And it is worth saying at once that it came to nothing without disaster. No war undid it. No fire consumed the records. No enemy rose up to shatter the sisterhood and scatter their long counting to the winds. The undoing was softer than any of that, and stranger, because it was made of a single choice and a single turning, small enough that the wider galaxy never noticed it happen at all. The order had come to a woman of theirs, a woman of great discipline, who served in the household of a duke. She had been instructed, as her mothers before her had been instructed, in the matter of the child she was to bear. The counting had told the sisterhood that the flower was near now, one generation off, perhaps two. And so the woman had been told what child she must bring into the world, and by whom, and of what sort it must be, for the graft to hold and the way to shorten as the plan required. It was a small instruction in its way. It concerned only a birth, only the beginning of one more life, but it was the hinge upon which the whole long design now turned. And here, in this telling, the hinge simply did not close. Whether it was the woman's own quiet choice, made out of love for the man she served and a wish to give him the child his heart wanted, or whether it was some plainer turning of ordinary fate, a matter of chance no deeper than the toss of a coin, the child that came was not the child the plan had asked for. The graft did not take as it was meant to take. The rare branch bent a hand's width the wrong way, and the flower the sisterhood had waited 3,000 years to see did not form upon it. A boy was born, whole and healthy and dearly loved, and he was not the shortening of the way. He was only a son. It is a gentle thing to consider how little sound so large a failure made. Somewhere in the deep libraries of the Order, the counting went on, and one entry did not resolve the way the entries before it had promised. A sister somewhere, decades on, would eventually mark the line and understand that the moment had passed, that the near generation had come and gone and left no flower behind. And even then there would be no thunder. There would only be a small cold understanding, and a turning of the page, and the resumption of a plan that must now reach forward again, patient once more, hopeful once more, into a further and less certain distance. The sisterhood had waited millennia. They would learn, softly, to keep waiting. For the boy himself, of course, none of this was ever visible. He grew up beneath an open sky beside a moving sea, and never once felt the absence of the thing he was supposed to have been. You cannot miss a destiny you never carried. He did not wake in the night mourning the oceans of time that would never open behind his eyes. He did not feel the ancient plan let go of him, because there was, in him, nothing left for it to hold. It had passed him by the way weather passes by a sleeping house, and he slept on beneath it, warm and unknowing, and in the morning he was simply himself. And what of the great powers of that vision, the reaching sight, the standing in the place where all times meet? Those powers, in this telling, stayed folded up and unopened, like a letter never delivered, like a door in a wall that no one ever finds. They were not destroyed. Nothing was destroyed. They simply were not called into being. The terrible gift that would have let a man see every path and every death and bear the crushing knowledge of them was never handed to him, and so he never had to carry it, and so it never bent his heart out of its ordinary human shape. There is a quiet mercy in a gift withheld. The boy would live his whole life without ever knowing he had been offered the whole of time and had been, without a word, allowed to decline it. The sisterhood, meanwhile, turned onward through the galaxy as they always had, advising in the courts of the mighty, marrying where they were told, bearing children where they were told, counting still. They had lost a generation, but they were an order built for the long patience, and one lost generation was, to them, a single missed step in a march that had already lasted longer than empires and might last longer yet. They folded the failure into themselves without complaint and kept walking. And in this too there is something restful to consider, that even the grandest and most patient of plans can slip a single stitch and simply carry on, that the missing of one appointed hour is not the end of the world, that the shadows close again over the small gap and the great slow work resumes as though the gap had never been. It is worth resting a moment on the tenderness of the woman at the center of it all, for hers was the hand upon the hinge, whether by choice or by chance, and hers was the heart that would have had the most to answer for if the order had ever thought to ask. She had been raised within the sisterhood since she was a small girl, given over to their long purposes before she was old enough to choose. Yet somewhere in the serving she had learned to love, plainly and warmly, the man she had been placed beside, and out of that love had come a wish so simple and so human that no ancient plan could have accounted for it. She wished to give him what his heart most wanted, and to hold in her own arms the child she herself most wanted. And if that wish had bent the great design a hand's width from its course, then she had bent it for reasons the design had never learned to weigh. There is something quietly triumphant in that so vast and cold a plan could be turned, in the end, by a woman loving a man and wanting an ordinary child. So the design came undone, gently, and no one wept for it, and the one person it had been built around never learned it had existed. The plan slept, the powers slept, the prophecy slept in its old jar, its wax seal unbroken. And out on the ocean world, in the household of a duke, a boy went on growing up in the plain, warm, ordinary way, loved for himself and not for what he might have been, which is, when you think on it, in the quiet dark, the very best way that anyone can be loved. Up next in Chapter 3, Kaladin and an ordinary boyhood will return to the sea cliffs and the great old house and follow the slow, untroubled days of a boy who was simply a boy and the good men who taught him. Chapter 3. Kaladin and an ordinary boyhood. Let us stay a while longer on Kaladin, for it is a good place to rest. And the boyhood of Paul Atreides upon that green and rain-washed world was a good and gentle thing, and there is no harm and much comfort in dwelling upon it slowly. The world itself invites slowness. It is a place of water and mist, of long gray mornings that ripen toward pale afternoons, of forests heavy with damp and cliffs where the seabirds wheel and cry. The great house of the Atreides stood above the water, old and strong, its stones worn smooth by centuries of weather, and within its walls a boy grew up surrounded by the ordinary machinery of a noble childhood, which is to say, by duty and by kindness in roughly equal measure. He was taught by a handful of remarkable men, and it is worth lingering on each of them, for they shaped the boy the way water shapes a stone, patiently and from every side. There was a warrior poet, a scarred and heavy-shouldered man who carried a balisette slung across his back as readily as a blade at his hip, and who could sing an old ballad in a low, rough voice, and then, in the same breath, teach a boy how to hold a knife, so that he might keep his life a little longer in a dangerous world. This man loved music and loved fighting, and saw no contradiction between them, and something of that wholeness passed into Paul, so that the boy learned early that a person might hold gentleness and hardness together, without being torn by the holding. There was another teacher, a swordmaster of great renown, lithe and merry and deadly, who moved through a training bout like a man dancing, and who laughed easily and often. He taught Paul the blade, and more than the blade, he taught him a certain lightness, a way of meeting danger with a grin rather than a grimace, a way of loving life so plainly that one fought all the harder to keep it. The boy adored this man, the way a child adores an older friend who never talks down to him, and the lessons went in deep precisely because they were wrapped in warmth and never in fear. And there was a third, older and stranger than the others, a man whose mind worked with the cold, clean precision of a machine, for he had been trained in an art that turned a human being into a living instrument of calculation. This one taught Paul to think, to hold many facts at once and weigh them against one another, to notice the small thing at the edge of a room that told the truth the center of the room was hiding. He was not a warm man, this teacher, not in the easy way of the others, but he was loyal past the edge of his own life, and he gave the boy the gift of a careful mind, which is a quiet gift and a lasting one. Now here is the thing to hold gently as you listen. In another telling of this life, all of this training would have been only a prelude, a sharpening of the blade before the true and terrible use of it. The boy would have taken these ordinary human skills and poured into them a power that was not human at all, until the blade work and the mind work and the poetry all became instruments of a fate too large to look at directly. But not here. Here the training was simply training, and the skills were simply skills. And they were meant for nothing grander than the living of a single human life. Paul learned to fight because a noble in a treacherous age must know how to fight. He learned to think because a clear mind is a good thing to own. There was no dark engine humming beneath the lessons, no destiny drinking them in. They were what they appeared to be, and being only that, they sat lightly on the boy and did him nothing but good. His days had a shape, and the shape was a comfort. He woke to the sound of the sea and the gray light through tall windows. He trained in the mornings, his body learning its slow, patient competence. He studied in the afternoons, maps and histories, and the endless tangled genealogies of the great houses, the arithmetic of trade, the names of far worlds he would probably never see. And in the evenings there was quiet, and food at a long table, and sometimes the low sound of a baliset from some other room. And the boy would grow drowsy the way children grow drowsy, all at once and completely, until he was carried off half sleeping to a bed that was always warm and always safe. His mother was near through all of it, a steady presence at the edges of his days. She had trained him too, in her own quieter arts, in the discipline of stillness and the reading of faces, and the deep, even breathing that keeps fear from taking the reins of the body. But in this telling, she taught him these things lightly, as useful skills for a life, and not as the forging of a weapon for a purpose he did not know he served. She loved him plainly, and watched him grow, and asked nothing of him but that he grow well. And he did grow well, straight and strong and kind, a little too serious sometimes in the way of thoughtful children, but sound all the way through. His father, the Duke, came and went, as the cares of a great house allowed, but when he came, he was wholly there. He would take the boy walking along the cliff paths in the gray wind, and he would speak of things that mattered, of what it meant to hold power over other lives, of the debt a ruler owes to the ruled, of the difference between being feared and being followed. He believed, this Duke, that a man could rule by loyalty rather than by terror, that people would give their hearts freely to a leader who first gave his own, and he tried to plant that belief in his son. Paul listened and walked and watched the birds turn over the water and let the words settle into him. They were not the words of prophecy. They were the words of a good man trying to raise a good man, and that is a smaller thing than prophecy and a warmer one. There were friends, too, and small adventures, and the ordinary scrapes of boyhood. There were days lost to nothing in particular, days that left no mark and asked to be remembered by no one, and these unremarkable days were perhaps the truest treasure of that time, though the boy could not have known it. For a childhood made only of great moments is not a childhood at all. It is the long, soft stretches of nothing much, the rainy afternoons and the drowsy dinners and the familiar faces in familiar rooms that knit a person together and give them a solid floor to stand on for the rest of their days. Paul was given that floor, plank by ordinary plank, and it held. And beneath all of it, unseen and unfelt, ran the great gift of this whole telling, which was simply that nothing pulled at him. No future crowded his sleep. No destiny leaned its weight against his small shoulders. He was free in the deepest and quietest way a person can be free. Free of the knowledge of what was coming. Free to meet each plain day as it arrived, and let it go again when it was done. He did not know he was free of these things, for you cannot feel the lifting of a weight you never carried. He only felt the ordinary lightness of an ordinary boy in an ordinary happy life, and he took it, as children take everything, entirely for granted, which is exactly as it should be. Up next in Chapter 4, Arrakis without the Messiah, will follow the great old house as it leaves the sea behind and comes at last to the desert world, arriving not as a legend fulfilled, but only as a duke and his household, into the sand and the wind and the wary quiet of a hard new home. Chapter 4. Arrakis without the Messiah. The time came, as it always must in the affairs of the great houses, for the family to leave the ocean behind. By the command of the emperor, whose word moved worlds the way a hand moves game pieces across a board, House Atreides was granted the stewardship of a distant planet and ordered to take it up. And so the Duke, and his lady, and the boy who was simply a boy, gathered their household and their soldiers and their long history, and they crossed the immense dark between the stars, and they came down at last upon the driest world that men had ever chosen to live upon. Its name was Arrakis, though most who feared it and needed it and bled for it called it by an older name that meant, plainly, the desert. It was a world without seas. Paul, who had grown up beside the endless moving water of Caladan, looked out for the first time upon a land where no water moved at all, where there were no rivers and no rain and no gray ripening mornings full of mist, only sand and rock, and a sky burned pale by a sun that gave no mercy. The dunes ran to the horizon in long, slow curves, like the swells of a sea that had been stopped forever in the middle of its rolling, and the wind picked up the fine dust and carried it in veils across the light. It was beautiful in a way that frightened, and it was harsh in a way that no amount of beauty could soften. And the boy understood at once, standing in the dry furnace of that first afternoon, that this was a place that would ask a great deal of anyone who tried to live within it. Now here is where this telling parts most sharply from the shape the universe expected, and it is worth speaking of the difference softly, for it is the very heart of the peace this story offers. On this world there lived an old prophecy. Long ago, the seeds of a legend had been planted among the desert people, a belief carried in their songs and their dreams that one day a voice from the outer world would come to them, a leader born off-world who would lift them up and turn their dry planet green and free them from all their long suffering. In another shape of things, the boy who now stepped down onto the sand would have been folded into that legend the moment he arrived. The desert people would have looked upon him and seen the promised one, and the great machinery of prophecy would have closed around him like a hand, and there would have been no escaping it, and it would have led in the end to fire across 1,000 worlds. But not here. Here the boy came down onto the sand as nothing but the son of the new Duke. No secret sight had been seated in him. No hidden certainty told him that this world was his to save. And though the old legends still slept in the songs of the desert people, waiting as it had waited for centuries, there was in this arriving boy nothing for it to fasten upon. He did not fit the shape of the promised one, because in this telling he had never been made to fit it. He walked down onto Arrakis as a stranger walks into a strange country, curious and cautious and a little afraid, with no idea that he was supposed to be anyone in particular, because he was not. He was only himself arriving into a place that owed him nothing and offered him nothing but the plain, hard chance to try to live. The household set about its work, as households do. There was a great fortress city to occupy, and its defenses to be understood, and its many dangers to be weighed, for the family had been given this world by an emperor who did not love them, and taken it from an older house that hated them, and there was peril woven through every corner of the gift. The men who had taught the boy on Caladan now bent themselves to the harder task of keeping the whole household alive in a place where the very air was hostile and where enemies both seen and unseen pressed in from every side. And Paul watched them work and learned the shape of this new danger, and felt for the first time the true weight of what it meant to belong to a great house in a treacherous age, no longer as a lesson spoken on a cliff path, but as a cold, real thing he could feel in the dry wind. He learned about the desert people, too, and here his curiosity ran ahead of his caution. They were a folk shaped entirely by the harshness of their world, spare and watchful and hard, and they had made of scarcity a whole discipline of living. They wore suits that reclaimed the very moisture of their bodies, for on Arrakis water was more precious than any coin, and a person's worth was measured in the water they carried and the water they owed. They moved through the deep desert in ways the off-worlders could barely follow, and they endured what the off-worlders could barely imagine, and they watched the newcomers with dark, careful eyes that gave nothing away. In another telling, they would have watched this particular boy and begun, slowly, to wonder if the promise had come at last. In this one, they watched him only as they watched all outsiders, warily, waiting to see whether he would prove worth the water it took to keep him alive. And Paul, for his part, felt no destiny stir in him at the sight of them. He felt only interest, the plain human interest of a thoughtful young man meeting a people wholly unlike any he had known. And beneath the interest, a quiet respect that grew the more he understood of how they lived. He did not look at the desert and see a kingdom waiting for him. He did not look at its people and see an army he was born to lead. He looked at the desert and saw a place that would be very hard to survive. And he looked at its people and saw those who had already learned how. And something in him, some sound ordinary humility his father had planted long ago, told him that if he wished to live here, he would do well to learn from them rather than to rule them. It was not the thought of a Messiah. It was the thought of a sensible young man, and it would serve him far better than prophecy ever could. So the family settled into its dangerous new home beneath the burning sky, and the days took on a new and warrior shape than the soft days of Kaladin had ever held. There was no sea to watch in the evenings now, only the swift falling of a desert night and the sudden fierce brightness of unfamiliar stars. The boy would stand sometimes at a high window, as he had once stood above the ocean, and look out instead across the dunes going blue and then black in the dusk, and feel how far he was from everything he had known, and feel, too, a strange small thrill at the sheer unknown breadth of it. He did not know what lay ahead of him in that dark and waterless land. That was the whole truth of him, and the whole gift of this telling. He did not know. Like every other soul beneath those stars, he could only wait and watch, and step forward blindly into a future that no vision had ever shown him, one plain, uncertain day at a time. Up next in Chapter 5, The Fall Still Comes, we'll follow the turning of a betrayal that spares no one for being ordinary, and see a great house broken, and a mother and her son cast out into the sand with nothing but each other and the night. Chapter 5, The Fall Still Comes. There are nights on Arrakis when the wind lies down at last, and the desert holds its breath, and even the great worms sleep somewhere far beneath the dunes. On one such night, in the city of Arrakis, the house of Atreides was betrayed. It happened much as it had always been fated to happen, in every telling of this story, in every branching of the years. For even without a prophet in its ranks, even without a boy who could see the shape of things to come, House Atreides had walked into a trap laid with great patience across many quiet seasons. The Emperor had feared Duke Leto, though the Duke had wished no harm upon the throne. He had feared the love the people bore him, the way soldiers followed him, not out of dread, but out of devotion, and how such love, gathered slowly, could one day outshine a crown. And so the Emperor had made his arrangement with the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, the old enemy of the Atreides, and together they had prepared the ending of a noble house. The gift of Arrakis, the richest world in the known galaxy, had never been a gift at all. It had been a beautifully wrapped snare, and Leto had known this, and had walked into it with his eyes open, because a duke does not refuse the will of his emperor and live. That night, the shields of the city failed. They failed because a trusted man had been broken, not by cruelty alone, but by love turned against him, his heart used as a lever to pry loose his loyalty. The Dr. Yue, bound by the soup conditioning that was meant to make betrayal impossible, had been bent past the breaking of it, and so the impossible was done. He lowered the house shields, and into the sudden gap poured the Harkonnen legions and the Emperor's own soldiers wearing borrowed colors, the dreaded Sardaukar, the finest killers the Imperium had ever raised. In this telling, Paul Atreides was only a boy of 15 years, gifted and brave and well-made, but no more than that. He had no visions to warn him. He did not wake in the dark with the taste of blood already in his mouth, foreseeing the ruin before it arrived. He simply woke because the noise of the fighting reached his chamber, because the floor beneath him trembled, because something in the ordinary animal part of him understood that the safe world of his childhood had ended in the space of a single hour. He had trained for danger with Gurney Halleck and with Duncan Idaho and with the old Mentat Tufir Hawat, and that training took hold of his hands now and steadied them. But he did not know how the night would end. No man knew. That was the whole of it. In this life, he was as blind to the future as any frightened child, and he was frightened, and he moved anyway. His mother, the Lady Jessica, came to him through the smoke. She was Bene Gesserit trained, and her calm was a made thing, a discipline laid over terror, but it held. Together they were taken by the attackers, for the plan of their enemies was not merely to kill them, but to see them lost cleanly in the desert, where the sand would do the work and leave no blame upon anyone. They were bound and carried out beyond the walls, out to where the great emptiness began, and there in the deep night they were meant to die quietly and without witness. That they did not die was owed to the Dr. Yue, who had one last thing to give. Before the fall he had hidden a means of escape, a small mercy folded into his great betrayal, for he had loved his own wife and had wanted, at the last, to strike back at the men who had taken her from him. Through the failing of the guards, through a knife concealed and a moment seized, Paul and Jessica came free of their bonds in the dark of the desert, and their captors did not survive the seizing. And then there was nothing around them but sand, and the cold that comes to the desert at night, and the stars wheeling overhead in their slow, uncaring turn. Somewhere behind them, the city burned. The Duke was lost. Leto Atreides, who had been a good man and a fair one, who had dreamed of raising the fortunes of his house without treading upon the weak, was gone. He had spent himself in one final defiance, a last effort against the Baron that did not save him. And Paul would carry the not knowing of his father's end for a long while, the way the living carry the newly dead, as a weight without a shape. There had been no vision to prepare the boy for the loss, no foreseeing to soften it, no sense that any of this served a larger design. It was simply grief, plain and human, the oldest grief there is, a son who has lost his father in the night. And so the two of them stood at the edge of the great desert with nothing. No house, no soldiers, no wealth, for the wealth of Arrakis had passed back into Harkonnen hands. No name that would open any door, for a hunted name is worse than no name at all. They had the clothing on their bodies and a little that Yue had left them, and each other, and the knowledge that the whole of the Imperium believed them already dead. In one sense, that belief was a small shield. A dead man is not pursued. But it was also a door closed behind them, for there was no going back to who they had been. Jessica looked out across the dunes, and she understood many things at once. She understood that the sisterhood's long work, the careful breeding of bloodlines across 90 generations meant to produce a being who could see across time, had come to nothing in her son. She had known this for years, quietly, and had made a kind of peace with it. Paul was clever, and he was strong, but there was no God sleeping inside him, waiting to wake. In another version of this night, that hidden power might have stirred at last, called forth by terror and by the strange chemistry of this world. But not here. Here there was only a mother and a son, ordinary as bread, standing in a place that killed ordinary people as a matter of course. She did not despair, though she had every reason to. She had been trained past despair. And Paul, for his part, did the one thing that was left to him, which was to keep moving. He had heard the tales of the desert people, the Fremen, who lived out here in the deep places where no soldier of the Imperium dared follow. He did not think of them as saviors. He had no legend telling him they waited for him, no prophecy naming him their lord. He thought of them simply as people who knew how to live where he was about to die, and he thought that if he and his mother were to see another dawn, they would have to find such people and learn from them, and be no more than that, seekers of shelter in a hard land. So they walked. They walked away from the burning city, out into the dark, two fugitives with empty hands and no destiny to carry them. Above them, the two moons of Arrakis rode the sky, and the sand held its terrible cold, and somewhere far off a worm turned in its sleep. And the desert, which cared nothing for kings or messiahs or the falling of great houses, simply waited to see whether these two small figures would prove worthy of the only thing it ever offered anyone, which was another day of life bought at the price of endless care. Up next, in Chapter 6, The Desert with No Legend, we'll follow Paul and Jessica deeper into the sands and find the Fremen as they truly are, a wary people with no chosen one to welcome, and see how a boy with no prophecy must begin to earn, by hand and by endurance, the smallest right to belong. Chapter 6, The Desert with No Legend. The desert of Arrakis is a patient teacher, and its first lesson is always the same. It teaches that a person is very small, and that the sand is very large, and that no name a person carries out into the dunes will earn them a single drop of water. Paul Atreides and his mother learned this lesson slowly, over the long days after the fall, as they moved southward and eastward into country that no map of the Imperium had ever properly charted, because no one who owned such maps had ever wished to live there. They had a little help. At the beginning, the desert ecologist Kynes, the man the Emperor had set to study Arrakis, had shown them a kindness before he was lost to the sands himself. He had given them the barest tools of survival and a few words on how to walk so that the great worms would not feel the rhythm of their steps, for the worms come to steady sound the way a hunter comes to a footprint. Walk without pattern, he had told them. Break your stride. Let the desert hear nothing it can name. And so they crossed the open sand in a shuffling, broken, arrhythmic gait, and the worms did not come for them. And this was the first skill that Paul learned in his new life, the skill of moving through the world without being noticed by the things that could swallow him whole. He noticed, in those first days, how completely the old world had fallen away. On Caladan, he had been the son of a duke, and doors had opened before he reached them, and men had bowed. Here there were no doors and no men, only the wind and the heat of the day and the biting cold of the night and the slow arithmetic of water, always the water. His still suit, the close garment that reclaimed the body's own moisture and gave it back to drink, became more precious to him than any title he had ever held. He learned to seal it properly, to tend it, to trust his life to it, because out here, a poorly kept stillsuit was a death sentence written in small, careless mistakes. There was, in all of this, a strange and quiet mercy. Paul had no legend to live up to. In some other turning of the world, the Fremen of Arrakis had held for many centuries a prophecy, planted long ago by the Bene Gesserit in their patient way, that a voice from the outer world would come to them. a lisan al-gaib, a Mahdi, one who would lead them out of bondage and make the desert bloom. In some other turning, Paul might have arrived among them, wrapped in that story, and they might have looked at him with the terrible hope of a people who have waited too long. But in this life, that hunger did not fasten upon him. He was not received as a savior. He was received, when he was received at all, with suspicion, as a stranger from the soft worlds who had no right to the water in his own flesh. For the Fremen found them, of course. One does not cross the deep desert unobserved. The desert people had watched Paul and Jessica for longer than either of them knew, from the shadows of rock, from the mouths of hidden caves, judging them the way the desert judges everything, by whether they wasted water and by whether they were fools. And Paul and Jessica, without meaning to, had passed a kind of test. They had not wept away their moisture. They had not thrown themselves down to die. They had kept moving, and they had kept their discipline, and this the Fremen understood and respected, for it was the first thing their own children were taught. When at last the desert people stepped from the rocks, Paul understood that his life now hung by a very thin thread. These were hard people, lean and watchful, their eyes the deep blue of long spice exposure, blue within blue, so that they seemed to look at him out of the color of the sky. They owed him nothing. He was no lord to them, no chosen one, no fulfillment of any old promise. He was an outsider with water in his body, and by the old law of the desert, the water of an outsider might rightfully become the water of the tribe. There was a real chance, in those first moments, that they would simply take it, that Paul and his mother would end there, rendered down for the moisture the tribe could not afford to waste. That they were not killed was owed to no destiny. It was owed to smaller and more human things. Jessica, with her Bene Gesserit training, moved and spoke in ways that gave the Fremen pause, for she carried herself with a discipline they recognized and could not easily dismiss. And Paul, though only a boy, had been trained by masters, and when one of the desert warriors moved to test him, Paul met the test and did not fall. He did not win by any hidden power. He won because Gurney Halleck had drilled him past exhaustion in the practice yards of Caledon, because Duncan Idaho had taught him the economy of a fighter who cannot afford a wasted motion, because his young body was quick and his nerve did not break. It was ordinary skill, honestly earned over years, and it was enough, on that day, to make the Fremen decide that these two strangers might be worth more alive than dead. But being spared is not the same as being welcomed. Paul understood that clearly. He had been granted only the chance to prove himself, and nothing more, and the proving would be long. The Fremen did not hand out belonging. Every place among them had to be earned, drop by drop and day by day, through labor and endurance and the slow building of trust. There would be no shortcut for him, no prophecy to carry him past the hard middle part of the work. He would have to become useful. He would have to become, in the end, one of them. And the only road to that was through his own two hands. Jessica understood something further, watching her son among these people. She saw that here, at last, he might have the one thing his birth had nearly denied him, which was a life measured by what he did rather than by what he was born to. On Caledon, he would always have been the Duke's heir, weighed down by expectation. In the wider Imperium, had things gone differently, he might have been weighed down by something far heavier, by the terrible expectations of a people who wanted a god. But in the desert, stripped of all of it, he was simply a young man being given the chance to work his way into a place among others. It was a smaller life than the one prophecy might have handed him. It was also, she thought, a cleaner one. And so Paul began. He carried what he was told to carry. He learned the names of things in the desert tongue, slowly, the way any newcomer learns, with mistakes that made the children laugh. He watched how the tribe moved, how they shared water, how they honored their dead by reclaiming even the moisture of the fallen, so that nothing was wasted and no one was truly lost. He was clumsy at first, and then a little less clumsy, and the desert people watched him the whole time with their patient, sky-colored eyes, waiting to see whether the soft boy from the outer world would harden into someone the desert could keep. Above them, the sun crossed its burning arc, and the sietch waited in the rock, hidden and cool and full of a life Paul had not yet begun to understand. He was not their legend. He was only a stranger being slowly, grudgingly, given a chance. And that, for the first time since the fall, was something he could hold on to. Up next in Chapter 7, A Fremen Among Fremen, we'll go down into the sietch itself and watch Paul learn the deep disciplines of desert life, the water and the worm and the krisk knife, and see how a young man becomes, through nothing but hard ordinary labor, one of the tribe at last. Chapter 7, A Fremen Among Fremen. Deep within the rock of the desert, hidden from the sky and from the eyes of the Imperium, there were places the Fremen called sietch, which in their old tongue meant a place of gathering in time of danger. To an outsider, these caves would have seemed only shadow and stone, but to the desert people, they were home, and warmth, and safety, and the slow patient center of a whole way of living. Into one such sietch, a community carved into a mountain of dark rock, far out in the deep desert, Paul Atreides was at last allowed to come, not as a lord and not as a legend, but as a stranger on trial, permitted to enter and to labor and to prove, over a long stretch of ordinary days, whether he might belong. He learned the water discipline first, because in the sietch nothing mattered more than water. On Caladan, water had fallen freely from the sky and gathered in wide gray seas, and Paul had never once thought about it, the way a person does not think about the air. Here it was the measure of all things. It was wealth, and it was life, and it was hoarded and counted and tended with a care that at first seemed strange to him, and then, slowly, came to seem simply right. The Fremen carried the water of their dead, reclaiming it so that a person who died gave one last gift to the tribe, and Paul learned that this was not grim to them, but tender, a way of keeping the beloved present in the flesh of the living. He learned to reckon a person's worth partly in the water they held, and to understand that to share water was among the deepest things one desert person could do for another. He learned the ways of the stillsuit, until they became as natural to him as breathing, the seals and the catch pockets and the tube at the neck through which a person drank back their own reclaimed moisture. He learned to move in the desert by night when the heat was gone, and to shelter in the shadow of the rock by day. He learned the arrhythmic walk more fully now, the broken cadence that told the great worms nothing, until his body knew it without his mind having to command it. And when at last he was taken out to see a maker, one of the vast worms of the deep desert rising from the sand in its terrible slow majesty, he felt the awe that every desert child felt, and something more, a sense of how small the affairs of houses and emperors truly were beside a thing so old and so enormous and so wholly indifferent to the schemes of men. He was given a krisk knife in time, and this was a matter of great weight among the Fremen. The krisk knife was made from the tooth of a maker, and it was a sacred thing, and by their law, a krisk knife once drawn could not be sheathed again until it had drawn blood. To be given such a blade was to be trusted with a piece of the desert's own body. Paul did not take this lightly. He had held fine weapons in his old life, blades of the finest imperial make, But none had meant what this crude curved tooth meant, because none had been given to him as a sign that a hard people were beginning, cautiously, to count him as one of their own. The learning was not gentle, and it was not quick. There were among the Fremen those who did not want him, who saw only the soft outsider and mistrusted the water in his body and the smoothness of his speech. There were tests, some spoken and many not, and Paul met them the only way he could, which was by working harder than anyone expected and complaining less than anyone thought he would. He took the tasks no one wanted. He carried loads through the long, dark passages of the siege. He learned to tend the wind traps that gathered the desert's small breath of moisture and the salvage of every scrap of usable material, for the Fremen wasted nothing, not water and not stone and not effort. His hands, once the smooth hands of a young noble, grew hard and scarred and capable. He did not mind. There was a plainness to the work that he had come to value, a sense that at the end of a day he had done real things that real people needed done. And slowly, drop by drop, the Sietch began to accept him. It happened not in a single grand moment, but in 1,000 small ones. A woman who had scowled at him began to hand him his portion without a word of complaint. A man he had labored beside began to share the small jokes of the tribe with him, and Paul, understanding them at last, could laugh. The children stopped treating him as an oddity and began treating him as simply one of the adults of the Sietch, which is to say they ignored him except when they wanted something, and this too was a kind of belonging. He learned the songs they sang in the deep of the cave, the old chants that told of water and of the long dream of a green Arrakis, and he came to feel the pull of that dream himself, the vision that the ecologist kinds had planted among them, of a world that might one day hold open water and growing things, generations hence, if only the desert people were patient enough to carry the work forward. His mother, meanwhile, had found her own hard place among the Fremen, for she carried the training of the sisterhood and the deep knowledge that came with it, and the desert people had ways of using such a woman. But Paul's road was his own, and it led him not toward any throne or any prophecy, but simply toward the ordinary standing of a Fremen man among Fremen men. He had no wish to lead them. He had seen enough of what leadership had cost his father to feel no hunger for it. He wanted only to be trusted, to be useful, to have a place at the fire and a right to the water, and the quiet regard of people who did not give their regard cheaply. There was a great freedom in this, though Paul did not always have the words for it. He was building a self out of his own actions, day by day, and no one had told him in advance who he was meant to become. He was not fulfilling anyone's prophecy. He was not carrying the weight of billions of unmet hopes. He was simply a young man in the desert, learning a hard trade, earning a hard place, and the plainness of it steadied him in a way that grandeur never could have. On Caladan, he had always been becoming the duke he was meant to be. Here he was only becoming himself, and the difference was everything. By the turning of the seasons, Paul Atreides walked through the passages of the Sietch and no longer felt a stranger there. He knew the names of the people, and they knew his. He had shared water and shared labor and shared grief, for the desert takes its due, and there had been losses. And he had learned the tribe's way of mourning. His stride had the desert's broken rhythm in it now, without his thinking. His eyes had begun, faintly, to take on the blue of the spice that was in everything the Fremen ate and drank and breathed. He was becoming a Fremen among Fremen, not by destiny and not by decree, but by the long, slow, honest labor of belonging, which is the only way that anyone truly belongs anywhere. And yet, for all that he was learning to live so fully in each present day, there remained one strangeness at the heart of Paul's new life, a thing that set him apart from the Messiah he he might have been in some other telling. He could not see forward. His nights were only nights. His future was as dark to him as the future of any of the desert people around him. And he was coming, slowly, to understand what a strange and weighty freedom that truly was. Up next in Chapter 8, No Visions in the Night, we'll rest with Paul in the quiet of the siege and consider the great absence at the center of his life, the prescience that never came, and the fear and the strange peace of feeling one's way forward into a future no one can foresee. Chapter 8, No Visions in the Night. There is a particular quiet that comes to the siege in the deep of the night, when the labor of the day is done, and the wind traps hum softly in the dark, and the whole community rests within the warm stone of the mountain. In that quiet, Paul Atreides would sometimes lie awake, not from fear and not from grief, though he had known both, but from a kind of wondering. He would lie awake and consider the thing that made his life so different from the life he might have led, and that thing was an absence, a great gentle emptiness where something enormous had never come to be. Paul had no visions. He never had. And in the stillness of those desert nights, he came slowly to understand what that meant. In another turning of the world, on a night much like these, the future might have opened before him like a vast and terrible landscape. The spice of Arrakis, breathed and eaten in everything the Fremen consumed, had strange effects upon the mind, and in one who carried the right blood and the right latent power, it might have torn away the veil that hides tomorrow from today. Such a one might have seen the branching paths of all possible futures spread out before him, might have watched himself walk 1,000 roads at once, might have known, with a certainty that no ordinary person can imagine, exactly what was coming and exactly what his choices would bring. That was the gift, or the curse, that the long breeding program of the sisterhood had reached toward across 90 generations. And in this life, it had passed Paul by. He felt its absence sometimes, on those wakeful nights, the way one might feel the absence of a limb one had never had. He did not know precisely what he was missing, only that there was a shape to it, a door in the dark that never opened for him. The spice moved through his body as it moved through every Fremen. His eyes had gone the blue of it. But it did not tear the veil. It did not show him tomorrow. When he closed his eyes, he saw only the ordinary drifting images of any tired mind, and when he woke, the day ahead was as unknown to him as it was to the child sleeping in the next chamber. At first, this had frightened him, in the early days after the fall. He had wanted, desperately, to know how things would turn out. He had wanted to know whether he and his mother would live, whether the tribe would keep them, whether the Harkonnens would find them, whether there was any future at all in which the pain of losing his father might come to mean something. He had wanted, in his grief and his fear, the comfort of a certain tomorrow, and there had been none. He had been forced to walk forward blind, feeling his way, one step and then the next, with no promise that the ground would hold. But something changed in him over the seasons, as he became a Fremen among Fremen and learned the desert's slow wisdom. He began to understand that the blindness he had feared was in truth the ordinary condition of every living person, and that there was in it a strange and quiet freedom. For a person who can see the future cannot truly choose. If tomorrow is already known, then every step toward it is only the walking of a path already drawn, and the walker is less a person than a passenger. Paul, seeing nothing, had to choose everything. Each morning he woke into a day that had not yet been written, and each thing he did freely, because he did it without knowing where it would lead. The uncertainty that had once terrified him began to feel, instead, like room to breathe. He watched the Fremen around him and saw that they lived this way as a matter of course, and lived well. They did not know whether the next season would bring plenty or hardship. They did not know whether a worm would rise beneath them or whether a raid would come in the night. They knew only that they must prepare as best they could and share their water and keep their discipline, and then meet whatever came with the strength they had built in advance. There was a kind of courage in this that Paul had never fully understood in his old life. The courage of people who do not know the ending and go forward anyway, doing the next right thing simply because it is the next right thing. He came to admire it deeply, and then, without quite noticing, to live it himself. He thought sometimes of the man he might have been. He did not know the full shape of that other Paul, the one who saw across time, but he sensed, dimly, that such a life would have been a heavy one. To hold the future in one's mind must be to carry a terrible weight, to know the cost of every choice before making it, to see the suffering that lay down every road, and to be unable to unsee it. He imagined that a man who could see the future might come to feel trapped inside it, might come to feel that he was only performing a story already told, unable to surprise even himself. And Paul, lying in the warm dark of the siege with the day ahead unknown, found that he did not envy that other man at all. His own life was smaller. It was also, he thought, freer and warmer, and more truly his own. There was a peace in this that settled into him over the years like water soaking slowly into sand. He stopped straining toward a future he could not see. He learned to give his attention to the day he was in, to the water he was tending and the people he was working beside, and the small, ordinary tasks that filled the hours. He found that a life lived this way, one honest day at a time, had a fullness to it that no foreknowledge could have granted. The taste of water at the end of a long day of labor, the sound of the children laughing in the passages, the slow companionship of the tribe as the seasons turned. These things were real precisely because they were unrepeatable, because they happened once and then were gone. Unforeseen and unrepeatable, and therefore precious. A man who could see all his tomorrows might have looked past this single evening toward the 10,000 evenings still to come. Paul, who could see nothing, had only this evening, and so he learned to love it. And there was Chani, though that is a story for a later night, the young desert woman whose regard he had begun to feel and to return. And even that Paul could not foresee, could not know where it would lead, and this too he found he preferred. He wanted to discover his life, not to remember it in advance. He wanted to be surprised by his own days. The great ocean of possible futures that might have opened to another man had stayed close to him, and Paul, lying awake in the quiet of the siege with the desert wind moving softly beyond the rock, found that he was, against all his early fears, glad of it. So the nights passed, one after another, dark and unknown and whole. Paul slept and woke and worked and lived, feeling his way forward into a future no one could foresee, and he was not a prophet, and he was not a god, and he was not the fulfillment of anyone's long design. He was simply a man in the desert, awake to his own single life, and the not knowing had become, in the end, a kind of gift. There remained, still, one door in the desert that he had not opened, one transformation that might yet have torn the veil away and shown him everything. But that, too, is a matter for another night, and a choice that Paul, in his hard-won peace, would come at last to make. Up next in Chapter 9, the water of life refused, will come to the threshold of that final door, the great transformation that could have made Paul a Messiah, and see how a man who has learned to love his ordinary life chooses, quietly, to leave it closed. There is a particular hour In the deep desert, when the heat of the day has finally loosened its grip and the sand begins to give back its warmth to the darkening sky. In that hour, within the stone hollows of the Sietch, the Fremen gathered for a thing they held above almost all others. It was the right of the water of life, the poison that a reverend mother might take and transform inside her own body, changing it from something that killed into something that opened the inner eye. For as long as any living Fremen could remember, this had been the doorway through which the sisterhood of the desert passed into their deepest knowing. And for as long as the wider prophecy had been whispered, there had hung upon it a further hope, that one day a man would come who could drink the unchanged water and live, and in that surviving would become more than any woman or man had ever been. Paul Atreides was present at more than one of these gatherings across the seasons of his life among the Fremen. He watched as an ordinary man watches a thing sacred to the people who have taken him in. He saw the old women bear the burden of the transformation, saw the drugged awareness spread through the assembled tribe like water finding every crack and stone, saw the way the whole community seemed for a while to breathe as one creature under the influence of the shared and terrible substance. He respected it. He did not seek it. And that small refusal, quiet as a footstep on soft sand, is where this chapter of his life turns. For there had once been, in another turning of fate that never came to pass here, a version of this man who would have felt the pull of that dark doorway as though it were his own name being called. In that other unfolding, some deep machinery within him, laid down across long generations of careful breeding, would have recognized the poison not as death, but as invitation. He would have drunk. He would have gone down into the place where past and future lie together, like the two halves of a single grain, and he would have come back changed beyond changing, a man who could see the countless branching roads of what was yet to come. But that machinery had fallen a generation short. The design meant to culminate in him had quietly failed, and so within Paul there was no hidden lock waiting for this particular key. He stood before the water of life and felt only what any brave and thoughtful man might feel, which was reverence and caution and no summons at all. The Fremen did not press him. Because there was no legend riding on his shoulders in this life, no whispered certainty that he was the one long promised, they had no reason to lead him toward the ordeal. He was a valued member of the tribe, a man who carried water discipline as well as any of them, a warrior they trusted at their backs. That was a great deal. It was not the same as being a figure out of prophecy, and neither he nor they mistook it for such. And so, the invitation that might have been extended in another world was simply never spoken here. The door stayed closed, and the closing of it made no sound. It is worth pausing, in the soft dark of this telling, on what exactly lay behind that unopened door. The Fremen believed, and the sisterhood believed, and it was in its way true, that a man who survived the water of life would gain a sight that reached across time itself. He would see the futures the way a person standing on a high dune sees the desert, all its ridges and hollows spread out at once, near and far together. Every choice he might make would fork before him into its consequences, and those consequences would fork again, until the whole ocean of possibility lay open to his inner eye. Such a man would never again be surprised by tomorrow. He would carry the weight of all the tomorrows at once. Paul never carried that weight. And here is the gentle heart of it, the thing worth resting upon as sleep draws near. To refuse that sight, whether by choice or by the simple absence of the buried gift, was to keep something that the prophesied man would have lost forever. It was to keep the ordinary mercy of not knowing. Each morning that came to Paul in the Sietch came as a genuine surprise, unwritten, unforeseen. When he woke, He did not know with terrible certainty what the day would bring. He had to live it forward, feeling his way, as every person who has ever lived has felt their way, blindly and bravely, 1 hour after the next. The future stayed a closed hand, and in that closed hand was a kind of peace. There were nights, of course, when he wondered. He was a thoughtful man, and thoughtful men turn things over in the quiet. He wondered, lying on his mat, with the recycled air of the sea edge moving softly around him, what it would be to know. He imagined, dimly and without the actual sight, what such knowing might feel like, and each time he imagined it, he found that it frightened him more than it tempted him. To see every road at once seemed to him less like power and more like a cage made of time, a place where a man could no longer be surprised by a kindness or a rainfall or the turn of a loved one's face. He decided, without ever having to decide it loudly, that he did not want the cage. He wanted the open hand, even empty. He wanted the ordinary dark ahead of him, into which he would walk not knowing. And so the water of life remained, for Paul, a thing observed and honored from the outside, the way one honors a mystery that belongs to someone else. The Reverend Mothers took it and were changed. The tribe drank of the shared awareness at their gatherings and were bound closer. Paul sat among them, present and warmed by their company, and let the deepest door stay shut. He did not become the vessel of all futures. He remained a single man walking through a single unfolding life, and that life, unremarkable as the prophecy would have judged it, was entirely and quietly his own. Consider, too, what it meant for the tribe around him. In another world, a man who had drunk the water of life and lived would have become the axis upon which all their hopes turned. They would have poured their longing into him, their grievances and their dreams of deliverance, until he was no longer a person to them at all, but a vessel for everything they wished the desert would become. Such a man cannot be a neighbor. He can only be a symbol, standing always at a distance, loved and feared in equal measure, alone at the center of a devotion too large for any single heart to hold. Paul was spared that loneliness as surely as he was spared the sight. Because he had not gone through the doorway, the Fremen could go on seeing him as one of themselves, a man who ate with them and worked with them and slept among them, near enough to touch. The refusal that kept him from godhood was the same refusal that kept him human, and kept him theirs in the ordinary way that one person can belong to another. There is a great deal of rest in that, to be spared the knowing, to lie down at night with tomorrow, still unwritten, still soft, still capable of surprising you with something good. The desert wind moved over the rocks above the sea edge, patient and old, and Paul slept the sleep of a man who did not have to bear the weight of every road at once. He bore only the weight of one, and that, it turned out, was a weight a person could carry. In the long dark of the desert night, the tribe slept around him, each of them carrying only their own single day. None of them asked to be more than a person, and the closed door of the future kept its gentle silence over them all. Up next in Chapter 10, a man, not a myth, will settle into the quiet dignity of that ordinary life, and watch Paul choose, again and again through the long seasons, simply to be himself, and find at last that being himself was enough. To live on Arrakis was to live under a sky that did not forgive, on a world that measured every creature by whether it could keep its water and keep its wits. It was a place that made no room for softness and offered no easy comforts. And yet, across the seasons that Paul Atreides spent among the Fremen, something took root in him that the harshness could not burn away. It was not glory. It was not the shimmer of legend. It was a plain and steady dignity, the kind that belongs to a person who has decided, quietly and for good, simply to be who he is. There had been a great deal that Paul might have become. The blood of a noble house ran in him. The training of masters lived in his hands, and once, in the counting of the sisterhood, he had been near to the center of a design meant to remake the shape of the human future. But that design had come to nothing in this life, and the great destiny had never opened. What remained was a man. Only a man, the prophecy would have said, with a faint note of disappointment. Yet in the siege, day by day and year by year, that only was slowly revealed to be a word with more inside it than anyone had guessed. For it turned out that to be no one special, on a world as unsparing as Arrakis, was itself a kind of achievement that had to be earned every single morning. Paul earned it. He rose when the others rose. He did the work that the desert demanded, the endless, careful work of keeping alive in a place that wanted you dead. He wore the still suit as the Fremen wore it, sealed and fitted and checked with the attention of someone who understood that carelessness was simply a slower name for dying. He spoke little and listened much, and the tribe came to know him not as a figure out of any story, but as a man who could be relied upon, which in the deep desert was the highest of all praises. There is a temptation, when we tell of a life, to reach always for the grand turnings, the battles and the crownings and the moments that echo. But Paul's dignity was not made of such things. It was made of the small choices, repeated so often that they became the grain of him. To share water with a thirsty companion, though he was thirsty himself. To take his turn at the hard tasks without being asked. To keep his word in matters so small that no one would have blamed him for forgetting them. To meet the eyes of the person before him and give them his true attention. Whether that person was an elder of the sietch or a child underfoot. These were the threads, and out of them the whole cloth of the man was woven. He might, in weaker hours, have grieved for the destiny he did not have. He was human, and humans measure themselves against the shapes of what they might have been. Somewhere in him there lived the awareness that a different Paul, in a different turning of the world, would have been a name spoken across 1,000 worlds, a man whose merest word could move fleets and topple thrones. But when that awareness rose in him, as it did now and then in the long desert nights, he did not feed it. He let it come, and he let it go, the way one lets a hot wind pass over the rocks. He had made a kind of peace with the size of his life. He had chosen, in the only way that matters, which is over and over rather than once, to be content with the man he actually was. And a strange thing followed from that choosing. The more fully Paul consented to be ordinary, the more the ordinary revealed its hidden richness. A morning of shared labor became, when he stopped waiting for something greater, a good morning in itself. The taste of water at the end of a dry day became a small and complete pleasure, needing nothing added to it. The trust of the people around him, slow to grow and unshowy, became a thing he could rest his weight upon. He discovered, as many have discovered before him and since, that a life does not have to be vast to be whole. It only has to be truly lived and truly inhabited by the one living it. The Fremen, for their part, had a keen eye for the true measure of a person. They lived too close to death to waste their regard on pretense. They watched Paul across the seasons, and what they came to feel for him was not the awe that a prophet inspires, but the deeper and warmer thing that a good neighbor earns. They knew he would stand at their side. They knew his water discipline was sound and his crysknife steady and his judgment cool. They knew, above all, that he had cast his lot in with them, not because a legend commanded it, but because he had chosen this place and these people freely, as a man chooses a home. That freely mattered to them more than any prophecy could have. A chosen one belongs to the choosing, A man who simply stays belongs to you. So Paul became, in the eyes of the Sietch, that rare and quiet thing, a person you were glad to have among you. Not a myth to be followed into fire and holy war. A man to share the water and the work and the long evenings with. It was less than the stories promised. It was, in every way that a person can actually live and feel and hold, a great deal more. It is a curious truth, and worth turning over slowly in the drowsy dark, that the world so often measures a person by the wrong yardstick. It counts the worlds they have ruled, the armies they have moved, the names that echo after them. By that measure, Paul was nothing. A man who had ruled nothing and moved no armies, and would leave behind no echo louder than the memory of the people who had actually known him. But there is another measure, quieter and rarer, that counts instead the daily faithfulness of a life. The promises kept, and the water shared, and the trust slowly earned. By that measure, Paul was rich beyond the reckoning of any empire. He had spent his years being reliable to the people around him, and reliability, in a place where a single failure could cost a life, was a treasure more precious than any spice hoard. The Fremen understood this measure in their bones. They had always understood it, because the desert had taught them that a person is worth exactly what they can be trusted to do when the sand turns hard. And when the day's labor was done, and the Sietch settled into its dim and breathing rest, Paul would sometimes sit for a while, with his back against the cool stone, and let the quiet fill him. He was no one special. He had refused the door to godhood, or rather that door had never had a lock that fit him, and either way it stayed shut. Ahead of him lay only the ordinary unknown, the plain, uncounted days of a single human life. And as he sat there in the gathering dark, he felt no lack in it. He felt, instead, the deep and unhurried sufficiency of being exactly and only himself, on a hard world, among people he had come to love. That, he had learned, was enough. It had quietly become more than enough. Up next, in Chapter 11, The Spice and the Simple Work, we'll follow Paul out into the labor of the deep desert itself, into the harvesting and the surviving, and the slow, steady rhythm of Sietch life measured, as all Fremen life is measured, in water and in work. The deep desert kept a rhythm all its own, older than any house or empire, a rhythm made of heat and cold, of wind and stillness, of the slow breathing of the great worms far below the sand. To live within that rhythm, as Paul Atreides came to live within it, was to have one's days measured not by ambition or event, but by the plain and repeating cycle of the work that keeps a people alive. And chief among that work, on Arrakis, was the spice. Spice was the reason the whole galaxy turned its greedy eye toward this bitter world. It lay in the open sand, formed by processes that ran deep and strange beneath the surface, gathered and hoarded and fought over by powers whose faces the Fremen rarely saw. But to the people of the Sietch, the spice was not first a treasure. It was first a fact of their lives, threaded through the air they breathed and the food they ate, coloring their eyes to the deep blue that marked all who dwelt long in the desert. And it was, when they chose to gather it, a hard and dangerous labor that Paul learned to share. To harvest the spice in the Fremen way was nothing like the great rumbling machines the off-worlders sent crawling across the dunes. The Fremen worked lean and quick and quiet, mindful always of the thing that the spice drew up out of the deep. For where there was spice, there came, sooner or later, the maker. The worm, the vast old lord of the sand, drawn by the rhythms of any sustained disturbance, rising from below to reclaim its domain. And so the work of gathering was always a work done against a clock that no one could see, listening always for the tremor in the sand, that meant it was time to be gone. Paul took his place in that labor, as he took his place in all the labors of the siege, without complaint and without any claim to be more than one pair of hands among many. He learned to read the sand for the tarnished cinnamon promise of a spice blow. He learned the discipline of the harvest, the swift gathering and the swifter withdrawal, the sense that had to be cultivated for the difference between a tremor that could be ignored and a tremor that meant a person had perhaps a handful of breaths left to reach safe ground. He learned, most of all, the patience of it, for the desert did not yield its wealth on any schedule but its own. And a person who tried to hurry the desert soon stopped being a person at all. Around the spice work turned all the other work, the endless smaller labors that together made survival possible. There was the tending of the wind traps and the moisture seals, those patient devices by which the Fremen coaxed water from an air that seemed to hold none, drop by miserly drop, hoarding each measure as another people might hoard gold. There was the care of the still suits, the checking of every seam and catch pocket, for a suit was a person's own private world, and a failure in it was a slow sentence. There was the reclaiming of water from every source, a discipline so total and so unflinching that it shaped the entire spirit of the people, teaching them that nothing living was ever truly wasted, that even the dead gave back their water to the tribe. Paul learned all of it, not as a lord learning about his subjects, but as a man learning how to stay alive among people who had made staying alive into an art. And there was, he found, a deep, quiet reward in the learning and the doing. The work was hard. It was also honest, in the way that only work against an indifferent world can be. The desert did not care who your father had been. It did not care what destiny you had once stood near. It asked only whether you had checked your seals, whether you had kept your discipline, whether you could be trusted with the water that meant everyone's life. And to answer those questions well, day after day, was to earn a satisfaction that no title could have granted. The rhythm of it settled into him over the seasons until it became the shape of his days. There was the rising in the cool before dawn, when the desert was kindest. There was the labor of the daylight hours, done in the sheltered places or in the swift necessary forays onto the open sand. There was the retreat into the Sietch through the worst of the heat, the sleeping and the mending and the quiet company of the tribe. There was the evening, when the world cooled again and the people gathered, and there was the long night, in which the Sietch breathed and rested and gathered itself for another turning of the same patient wheel. It was a life measured in water and in work, and Paul found that those two measures were enough to fill a life completely. Water, because on Arrakis water was life itself, counted and shared and treasured, the very currency of survival and of love. Work, because work was the daily proof that a person was still holding up their end of the great fragile bargain by which the Sietch endured. Between the two of them there was little room for grandeur and little need of it. A person who had gathered spice against the coming of the worm and mended a wind trap and shared true water with a companion had done a full day's living and could lie down at night with the clean tiredness of the honestly spent. There is a peace in that kind of tiredness that the restless and the ambitious never find. Paul found it again and again across the years. He would come in from the sand with the grit of the day upon him and the taste of spice in his mouth, and he would take his measured water, and he would feel in his aching muscles the plain confirmation that he had been useful, that he had belonged to the day's necessary work. It was not the exhaustion of a man who had moved worlds. It was the deeper and simpler tiredness of a man who had done what was in front of him to do, and done it well, and would do it again tomorrow. There was a wisdom hidden in this rhythm that Paul came only slowly to understand. The off-worlders who came to Arrakis wanted the spice and nothing else, and they took it with their great crawling machines and their contempt for the world that made it, and they never once belonged to the desert they plundered. The Fremen wanted the spice too, but they wanted it the way a person wants the fruit of their own careful garden, as one thread in a whole woven life, never torn loose from the water discipline and the worm wisdom and the deep respect for the sand that had made them who they were. Paul had crossed from the first way of wanting to the second. He had come to Arrakis in the beginning as a son of the powers who saw the world only as a prize. He had become, over the seasons, a man who saw it as a home, and a home is a thing you tend rather than a thing you seize, a thing that asks for your patience and gives back, in its own slow time, a belonging that no seized prize can offer. And so the seasons turned, spice blow and wind trap and shared water. The slow, deep rhythm of the Sayach carrying Paul forward as it carried all his people, unhurried, unheralded, and whole. Above the desert the stars wheeled in their ancient courses, and below the sand the great makers moved in their old slow dreams, and between them a man did his work and slept his sleep, and asked for nothing more than the day had already given. Up next, in Chapter 12, Chani and a life without empire will turn from the labor of the sand to the warmth at the heart of it, and follow the love between Paul and Chani as it grows, unbothered by thrones and holy wars, into the human-sized marriage of two people of the desert. Among all the things that Paul Atreides found in the desert, the one that mattered most was not a skill or a place or a hard-won respect. It was a person. Her name was Chani, a daughter of the Fremen, a child of the deep desert who moved across the sand as though she had been born from it. In another turning of the world, she would have stood at the side of a Messiah, a figure caught up in the vast machinery of prophecy and empire, her love for a man tangled forever with the fate of a galaxy. But in this life, there was no Messiah and no empire reaching for her, and so her love could be simply what love is, which is two people finding in each other a place to rest. They came to know each other slowly, as desert people come to know each other, through shared work and shared danger, rather than through any sudden declaration. Chani was of the Sayach, sure-footed and clear-eyed, quick with a crysknife, and quicker still to read the moods of the sand. Paul was the outsider who had become an insider, the noble-born man who had shed every claim of nobility and earned his place by hand and by endurance. They worked near each other, and then with each other. And somewhere in the long accumulation of ordinary days, the working became a wanting, and the wanting became a love that neither of them thought to name aloud, because among the Fremen such things were shown rather than spoken. There was no grand romance to it in the manner of the great tales, no love that shook the pillars of the Imperium, no bond that would one day be sung across 1,000 worlds. There was, instead, something both smaller and truer. There was the way she would check his stillsuit seals when he was tired and careless, and the way he would save the choicest portion of a meal for her, without either of them remarking on it. There was the ease of a silence shared between two people who did not need to fill it. There was the slow-growing certainty, built up drop by drop like water in a catch basin, that each of them had found in the other a companion for the whole hard length of a desert life. And because there was no jihad gathering on the horizon of their days, no throne being fought toward, no terrible future pressing down upon them, their love was free to be exactly the size of two human hearts. This is worth resting upon, in the soft dark of the telling. In another unfolding, the love between these two would have been a thing perpetually shadowed by destiny, a private warmth forever crowded by the demands of a role that swallowed the man whole. Chani would have loved a person who was also a symbol, a husband who was also a god, and the shadow of that vastness would have fallen across every tender moment. But here there was no such shadow. Here there was only Paul, a man, and Chani, a woman, and the plain, uncrowded space between them in which to build a life. They made their union in the way of the Fremen, without empire to sanction it, and without any court to witness it, only the tribe that was their world entire. It was a marriage of two desert people, human-sized and warm, sealed not by treaty, but by the simple mutual decision to face the sand together. And in the seasons that followed, that decision proved itself over and over in the small, hard currency of shared survival. When the water was scarce, they were scarce together. When the work was heavy, they carried it side by side. When the night was cold, as the desert night always was, they were each other's warmth against it. Paul had come a long way from the ocean world of his boyhood, from the green and generous planet of his childhood, to find his happiness at last on the driest world in all the known reaches. And he understood, in the way that a person understands a thing without needing to put words to it, that this was the truer wealth. He had once stood near a destiny that would have given him dominion over the futures of humankind. He had let that door stay closed, or rather, it had never opened for him, and in its place he had been given this instead. A woman who knew him not as a legend, but as a man. A partnership measured not in conquered worlds, but in shared water. A love with no empire in it at all. Sometimes, in the quiet of the siege, when the day's work was done and Chani slept beside him with the slow breathing of the honestly tired, Paul would lie awake for a while and consider the shape of what his life had become. He thought of the man he might have been, the man of prophecy, and he found that he could summon no envy for him. That other man would have possessed the world and lost the one thing that made a world worth possessing. He would have gained the vision of all futures and lost the simple grace of a single present. This present. This dark, warm quiet, with a person he loved breathing softly at his side. Paul would not have traded it. He was, he understood, a rich man, in the only account that had ever truly mattered. For a marriage without empire was not a lesser thing. It was, in its way, the greater and rarer thing, a love permitted to be only itself, undistracted by the weight of worlds. Chani was not the consort of a god. She was the wife of a man, and the man was hers, wholly and without division, no part of him owed to prophecy or promised to a cause. They belonged to each other, and to the desert, and to the small good work of keeping alive, and that belonging was complete. It asked for nothing beyond itself. It was, quietly and entirely, enough. In time there would be children, as there are in the ordinary run of human lives, small desert-born ones who would learn the water discipline at their parents' knees and grow up knowing the siege as their whole and sufficient world. They would not be the heirs to any throne. They would inherit no prophecy and no burden of empire. Only the plain good things their mother and father could give them, which were a name, a place among the people, and the knowledge of how to stay alive on a hard world and be decent while doing it. Paul, who had once stood so near to fathering a dynasty that might have reshaped the human future, found a deeper joy in fathering children who would simply be people, free to live their own small, uncounted lives. It was another of the quiet trades the desert had asked of him, and like all the others, he found he did not regret it. And so the two of them made their life together in the deep siege, season upon season, water shared and work shared, and the long nights shared. Two ordinary people who had found in each other the whole of what they needed. Above them the stars turned in their patient courses over the sleeping desert, indifferent to thrones, unmoved by empires, shining down the same soft light upon the great and the small alike. And beneath that light, Paul and Chani slept, unremarkable and unrecorded by any history, and utterly and quietly whole. Up next in Chapter 13, the Harkonnen Reckoning, human-sized, will turn to the old enemies who had broken House Atreides and watch the resistance against them unfold not as a holy crusade, but as men and women, plainly and bravely, defending the home they love. Chapter 13. The Harkonnen Reckoning, human-sized. In the older stories, the ones that never came to pass in this telling, the reckoning against the Harkonnens was a thing of terror and prophecy, a storm of green banners rolling across a burning world. Here, in the quiet of this softer history, it was smaller than that, and truer to the size of human hands. Paul Atreides did not lift a legend against the men who had murdered his father. He lifted only himself, and the loyalty of the people who had taken him in, and the patient, ordinary anger of those who had suffered too long under a cruel rule. The Harkonnens had come back to Arrakis as they always did, to squeeze the spice from its sands and the water from its people. Their soldiers walked the streets of Carthage and Arrakeen with the certainty of men who believed no one would ever answer them. In the deep desert, the Sietches watched and waited, as they had watched and waited for generations, counting the small cruelties, remembering the wells poisoned, the harvesters taken, the sons who never returned from the labor lines. There was no Messiah among them to promise a holy vengeance. There was only Paul, one man among many, learning the slow arithmetic of resistance. He learned it the way the Fremen had always learned it, by measuring what could be spent and what must be saved. Water first, always water, and then lives, which in the desert were nearly the same thing. A rebellion that spent its people carelessly would burn out in a single season, and the Harkonnens would grind the ashes back into the sand. So Paul thought in the manner Thufir Hawat had once taught him, long ago on a wetter world, weighing every move against its cost, never striking where the striking gained nothing. He was no prophet. He could not see the outcome of a raid before it happened. He could only plan carefully and hope and act and live with whatever came. The raids, when they came, were modest things by the measure of empires. A spice crawler stopped on the open sand, its crew disarmed and sent walking back toward the shield wall with their lives intact and their cargo gone. A supply depot emptied in the dark and left burning behind the retreating figures. A patrol of Harkonnen troops led into the deep desert by false trails and lost there, swallowed not by any supernatural power, but by the plain and total indifference of a place that killed the unprepared. The Fremen did not need a god to make the desert deadly. The desert was already deadly. They needed only to know it better than their enemies did, and they did. Paul took his place in these actions as one fighter among the others. He carried a crysknife now, milk white and warm, earned and named in the way of the tribe, and he carried it as a man carries a tool he has learned to respect rather than a symbol he expects others to worship. He was quick, and he was disciplined, and the training of Gurney Halleck and Duncan Idaho still lived in his hands, but he bled the same red as anyone, and he knew it, and the knowing kept him careful. There is a kind of courage that comes from believing oneself chosen and untouchable. Paul had none of that. His courage was the ordinary kind, the harder kind, the courage of a man who knows he can die and steps forward anyway, because the thing in front of him needs doing. The Harkonnens, for their part, did not understand what was happening to them, and their misunderstanding was itself a shield for the Fremen. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, floating heavy and slow in his private chambers far from the sand, read the reports of lost crawlers and vanished patrols, and saw only inefficiency, only the ordinary friction of governing a hateful world. He blamed his officers. He blamed the weather. He blamed the sabotage of rival houses and the laziness of his own troops. He did not imagine that the desert people, whom he counted as barely people at all, were fighting a slow and deliberate war against him, because to imagine that he would have had to grant them a competence he had never believed they possessed. And so, the reckoning gathered strength in the blind spot of his contempt. There was no single great battle to name this rebellion, no field where the Harkonnens were broken in an afternoon and a new order declared. That belonged to the other history, the one of thrones and holy wars. This resistance moved instead the way water moves through rock, patiently, finding the cracks, wearing them wider year upon year. The spice yields fell as the crawlers grew unsafe to send too deep. The cost of holding Arrakis climbed. The garrison thinned as troops were pulled to guard the profitable centers and abandoned the far outposts to the sand. Little by little, without any thunderclap of destiny, the grip of the oppressors loosened across the open desert, and the Sayaches breathed a fraction easier than they had before. Paul felt the weight of it as any man would. He knew the names of the fighters who did not come back from a raid, and he carried their names, and he sat with their families in the Sayach when the water of the fallen was returned to the tribe. There was no glory in it that could soften those losses, no vision of a redeemed galaxy to set against a single grieving mother. He had only the plain truth that they had chosen to defend their home, and that their home was worth defending, and that a life given for it was not a life wasted even when it could never be replaced. He learned to hold grief and resolve in the same hands, the way the Fremen had always held them, without letting either one drop. And there was, in all of this, a strange and healing rightness for Paul himself. His father had been killed by these people. In the other history, that death became the seed of an empire, and 100 billion deaths beyond it, a vengeance so vast it swallowed the meaning of the man it claimed to honor. Here, Paul's answer to his father's murder stayed the size of a son's love. He fought the Harkonnens because they were cruel and near and hurting the people he now belonged to, not because a prophecy demanded a galaxy in payment. Leto Atreides had been a good duke who cared for his people above his profit. The best tribute Paul could offer him was not a throne of skulls, but a life lived in that same spirit, defending ordinary people with ordinary courage, keeping faith with the small and the near. The reckoning, then, was human-sized, and that was its mercy and its dignity both. It asked no more of Paul than a brave man could give, and it granted no more than a free people could hold. When the Harkonnen shadow at last drew back from the deep desert, worn down rather than shattered, there was no coronation, no roaring crowd, no banner raised over a conquered world. There were only the Sayaches, a little safer than before, and the people in them going back to the endless patient work of living. Paul walked among them not as a liberator crowned, but as a neighbor who had done his share, and slept that night in his own chamber, tired in his body and quiet in his heart. A man who had paid an honest debt with honest hands and asked nothing more of the future than another ordinary day. Up next in Chapter 14, No Jihad Across the Stars, we'll follow the terrible future that never came, and rest in the quiet mercy of all the deaths that never happened, all the worlds that were spared a war they never knew they had escaped. Chapter 14, No Jihad Across the Stars. There is a mercy that no one ever sees, because it takes the shape of something that simply does not happen. It leaves no monument. It has no anniversary. No one lights a candle for the war that was never fought, or speaks the names of the billions who lived out their small, ordinary lives because a certain door in a certain desert stayed quietly closed. And yet this unseen mercy is the largest thing in the whole of Paul Atreides' story, larger than any battle he did fight, larger than the world he lived on. In this telling, the jihad never came. The holy war that might have burned across the stars was never lit, and the galaxy went on turning, unaware of how near it had drifted to the fire. To understand the size of what did not happen, one must first understand what the other history held. In that darker unfolding, Paul opened the deepest reaches of prescience and saw the future stacked before him like grains in an endless dune. Among them, again and again, no matter which path he tried to choose, he saw the same terrible thing rising. He saw his own name become a banner. He saw the Fremen pour off Arrakis in their millions, carrying his legend to every corner of the Imperium, conquering world after world in the name of a Messiah who had never asked to be worshipped and could no longer stop what he had become. He saw 60 billion people die beneath that banner across the years of the war. Whole planets sterilized, whole cultures erased, all in his name, all beyond his power to prevent once the flood had begun. The visions showed him the jihad as a thing almost alive, a hunger that used his person as its face and would not be denied its feeding. None of that happened here. Paul never opened that door. Without prescience, there was no ocean of futures to be trapped inside, no golden path narrowing toward slaughter, no terrible momentum gathering behind his name. He was simply a man in the desert, and a man in the desert cannot become a galactic tide. The Fremen loved him as a brother and a good fighter, but they did not see in him the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world come to lead them to paradise, because in this history, that prophecy found no one to attach itself to. And so the vast destructive love that would have carried them off their world and across the stars never kindled. They kept their fierceness for their own home, and their home was enough for it. Think, then, of all the worlds that never burned. Somewhere beyond Arrakis, on a green planet whose name Paul would never learn, a family sat at a table under an ordinary evening, and no fire fell from the sky, because there was no jihad to send it. On a crowded city world of 10 billion souls, the markets opened and closed and opened again, and the children grew up and grew old, and none of them ever heard the name Atreides, and none of them ever needed to, because the war that would have made that name a terror was never born. In this telling, those lives were not saved by any dramatic act. No hero flew to their defense. They were saved by an absence, by a thing withheld, by a young man on a distant world who never became the engine of their destruction. Paul himself could not know this. That is the strange and gentle heart of it. In the other history, he carried the full, unbearable knowledge of the war, saw every death before it came and after, bore the weight of 60 billion souls upon a single human conscience, and was hollowed out by it into something more and less than a man. Here he carried nothing of the kind. He did not know how close the galaxy had come to catastrophe, because there was no prescience to show him the roads not taken. He lived forward blindly, like everyone else, worried about water and weather and the safety of his people, entirely unaware that his ordinary anonymous life was, by its very smallness, the salvation of 100 billion strangers. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. A mercy that must be seen to be felt is a smaller mercy than one given freely into the dark. Paul saved those worlds not by heroic effort, but by remaining himself, by choosing again and again the near and the human over the vast and the visionary. And he was rewarded not with gratitude, for no one knew, but with the plain, quiet gift of a life he could actually live. He was never crowned, and he was never worshipped, and he was never devoured by a hunger wearing his face. He got to stay a man, and because he stayed a man, the stars stayed peaceful. In the ordinary, indifferent way that peace is mostly made of things not happening, there is a kind of arithmetic in this that soothes the mind precisely because it can never be fully counted. How many lives were spared? How many worlds went on? How many small tables in how many evening lights stayed whole and quiet and unburned? The number is too large to hold, and it does not need to be held. It is enough to rest in the fact of it, the way one rests in the knowledge that the sun will rise without needing to number the mornings. The jihad did not come. That single absence spread outward across the galaxy like calm across water, touching everything and disturbing nothing, and no one ever sent a word of thanks toward the desert man, who by simply being no one special had let it all be spared. For Paul, the days went on as days do. He fought the Harkonnens when they had to be fought, at the human scale, for human reasons. He shared water with his tribe. He learned the deep desert and its slow rhythms. He loved and he grieved and he grew older, and the future stayed unknown to him, and he was glad of that, not knowing more than he could have said. He did not feel the weight of the war he had prevented, because he never carried it, and the not carrying was itself the whole of the gift. A man who is spared a terrible burden does not feel its absence as lightness. He simply lives, unaware of the crushing thing he was never asked to bear. And so the galaxy turned on, vast and busy and blind, its billions living and dying in the ordinary proportions of ordinary life, none of them touched by a holy war, none of them knowing why. The great mercy of Paul Atreides in this history is that there is no story to tell of it. There is only the peace of a thing that did not happen, spreading quietly outward from one small world, asking to be noticed by no one, content to be nothing more than the largest kindness ever given, without a name. Up next in Chapter 15, the Emperor Unthreatened will look far from the desert to the golden heart of the Imperium, where a distant ruler sits secure upon his throne, never once feeling the shadow of a prophet who, in this gentler history, never rose to trouble his sleep. Chapter 15, the Emperor Unthreatened. Far from the sand and the wind of Arrakis, on the manicured world of Khitain, the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV ruled the known universe from a throne he never once feared to lose. The great halls of his palace stretched cool and bright beneath fountains that had never known thirst, and the courtiers moved through them in their slow ceremonial dance. And the business of the Imperium went on as it had gone on for centuries, orderly and vast and untroubled. In this telling, no rumor ever reached those halls of a desert prophet gathering an army in the deep of Arrakis. No fear ever crept into the emperor's careful nights. He ruled, and he grew old, and he never knew how close another history had come to unmaking him. To understand the peace of Shaddam in this gentler unfolding, one must set it against the storm that never broke. In the darker history, the one that did not happen here, the desert produced a Messiah, and that Messiah gathered the Fremen into a force that no throne could stand against. And in the end, the emperor himself was brought low, made to kneel, stripped of his crown by a young man risen from a world he had thought beneath his notice. That history turned upon a single hard truth that Shaddam never grasped until it was too late. The truth that the harsh little world he used as a spice mine and a prison had bred a people harder than any soldiers in his Sardaukar legions, and that those people had found a leader who could unlock their fury. In this history, there was no such leader, and so there was no such fall, and the emperor sat secure upon a foundation he never had to think about at all. The great irony of Shaddam's safety was that it rested entirely on an absence he could not perceive. He was kept upon his throne not by his legions, though he had them, and not by the scheming of his advisors, though he had those in plenty, but by the simple fact that on Arrakis a certain young man never became the chosen one. Paul Atreides, in the deep desert, fighting the Harkonnens at the human scale and asking nothing of destiny, was the reason the Imperium held. Had Paul opened the Messiah path, the throne would have cracked. Because he did not, the throne stood, and Shaddam, in all his golden security, never learned the name of the man whose ordinary choices had preserved him, never sent a single thought toward the desert that had, without knowing it, decided to let him keep his crown. The emperor's days were the days of a ruler who believes his order eternal. He received the reports of the great houses and weighed them against one another in the endless quiet war of the Landsraad. He tended the intrigues of his court, the marriages and the alliances, the slow movements of power that filled the years of a reign. When word came of trouble on Arrakis, of lost spice crawlers and thinning garrisons, and the stubborn resistance of the desert people, it reached him only as a minor administrative annoyance, a matter of Harkonnen inefficiency to be noted and dismissed. He never imagined that the sand held anything that could touch him. And in this history, for once, his blindness cost him nothing, because there truly was nothing there that would rise so high. The desert kept its fierceness at home. The Imperium remained, to the Emperor's eye, exactly as solid as it had always seemed. There is a peculiar restfulness in contemplating a great power that is never challenged, a stillness like that of deep water undisturbed. The wider galaxy, in this telling, felt no tremor from Arrakis. The spice flowed, a little more slowly than before, as the resistance made the deep desert costly. But it flowed, and the Spacing Guild folded space and moved the traffic of 10,000 worlds, and the Bene Gesserit continued their patient work in the shadows, and the great houses rose and fell in their measured way, and none of it was thrown into the chaos that another history had held. The machinery of 100 centuries turned on undisturbed, indifferent to the one hard little world at its edge, indifferent above all to the one man there who, by refusing to become a legend, had quietly guaranteed that the machinery would keep turning. For the Bene Gesserit, the peace of the Emperor was the sign of their own great failure, though only they could read it so. The sisterhood had labored across many generations to breed the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who could bridge space and time and bend the future to their design. In the darker history, that one was born and slipped their control and reshaped the Imperium in ways they never intended. In this history, the breeding fell a generation short, and no such being came into the world, and the sisterhood's long dream dissolved quietly into the ordinary flow of events. And so the very absence that kept Shaddam safe was also the absence that undid the Bene Gesserit's centuries of patience. The same missing thing served the Emperor and thwarted the sisters, and neither the served nor the thwarted ever fully understood the young man in the desert who was the shape of that absence. Shaddam grew old upon his throne in the ordinary way of emperors, which is to say slowly and surrounded by comfort and increasingly out of touch with the far edges of the realm he governed. His hair silvered, his court aged around him. The great questions of succession and legacy came to occupy him as they come to occupy all who rule long enough to feel the end approaching. But the one great question that had defined his reign in the other history, the question of the desert prophet who would pull him down, never once entered his mind, because that prophet never rose. He was, in the truest sense, an emperor unthreatened, and he lived out his reign in the untroubled security of a man who never learned how fragile his crown had almost been. And Paul, far away on the sand, knew nothing of any of this. He did not know the emperor's name mattered to his own story. He did not know that his ordinary life was the quiet guarantee of a distant throne. He harvested spice and shared water and buried his dead and loved his people, and the vast structure of the Imperium remained wholly beyond his horizon and wholly untouched by his intentions, and yet held in place by them all the same. The Emperor on Kytane and the desert man on Arrakis never met, never spoke, never once thought of each other, and were bound together nonetheless by the great gentle nothing that lay between them, the war that was never fought, the crown that never fell, the legend that never rose to trouble the golden sleep of the ruler of 10,000 worlds. Up next, in Chapter 16, A Sietch Life Through the Years, we'll return from the distant throne to the warm, close world of the Sietch, and watch the slow turning of seasons, the children born, the friendships deepened, and the patient greening dream carried forward by ordinary hands across the long span of the years. Chapter 16. A Sietch Life Through the Years. Time in the Sietch did not move the way it moved in the palaces of the great, in reigns and dynasties and the slow maneuvers of empire. It moved in water and in work, and in the turning of the desert seasons, and it carried Paul Atreides along with it through the long ordinary span of a human life. There were no coronations to mark the years, no conquests to number them by. There were only the small true things that make up a life anywhere, the births and the deaths, the friendships that deepened, the labor that never ended, and the patient dream of a greener world carried forward season upon season by hands that expected no glory for the carrying. The Sietch itself was a world entire, hidden in the rock, hoarding its water against the burning outside. Paul had come to it once as a stranger and a fugitive, and across the years he had become so woven into its life that the memory of his arrival grew soft and distant, as such memories do. He knew the passages in the dark now without needing light. He knew the sound of the wind at the Sietch mouth in every season, the dry roar of the storm months and the thin whisper of the still ones. He knew the faces around him, not as a newcomer studies faces, but as a man knows his own family, by the 1,000 small histories written into them, and they knew him the same way, as one of their own, tested and true and long past questioning. The seasons of Arrakis were harsh, but they had their rhythm, and rhythm is a comfort even when it is hard. There were the times of gathering, when the tribe went out to harvest the spice in the deep desert, reading the sand for the sign of the makers, working fast and leaving fast, taking what the desert offered and paying it the respect of caution. There were the times of stillness, when the storms locked the Sietch behind its walls, and the people turned inward to the work of the household, the mending and the making, the teaching of the young. There were the quiet ceremonies that marked the passing of water from the dead back into the tribe, solemn and unhurried, in which grief and continuance were held together in the same slow ritual. Paul lived through all of these turnings, year upon year, until the pattern of them was the pattern of his own days. Children came into the Sietch in their season, as children come everywhere, and Paul watched them grow, some of them his own, and some of them the Sietch's, for in the crowded warmth of that life, the line between the two was never sharp. He taught them the things he had been taught, though he stripped the teaching of its old grandeur and gave it plain. He showed them how to move on the sand without rhythm, so as not to call the maker. He showed them the water discipline, the counting of every drop, the reverence owed to the moisture of a living body. He showed them the krisk knife and what it meant to carry one. And he showed them, without ever saying so, that a man could be brave without believing himself chosen, strong without needing to be a legend. The children of the Sietch grew up under his hand, not as followers of a prophet, but as the sons and daughters of a good and steady man. And that was a better inheritance than prophecy. And it lasted. His friendships deepened in the way that only long time can deepen them, past words, into the easy silence of people who have shared decades of the same hard life. He had come from a world of oceans and a house of lords, and none of that mattered anymore to the people beside him. And its not mattering was a kind of freedom. Among the Fremen, a man was measured by what he did and what he shared, and whether he kept faith. And by those measures, Paul had long since become simply one of them, no more and no less. He sat in the councils of the Sietch, and his voice was heard, not because of any destiny attached to his name, but because he had earned the right to speak by living well and long among them. There is a respect that legends command, and a respect that neighbors earn, and the second is warmer, and it was the second that Paul was given. Through all these years there ran a quieter thread, the dream that the planetologist Liet Kynes had planted in the Fremen long before. The dream of a greened Arrakis, of water gathered and held, of the desert slowly softened into something that could hold gardens and open water beneath an open sky. In the other history, that dream had been swallowed by the fire of the jihad and twisted toward other ends. Here it stayed what it had always been, a patient generational labor, carried forward by ordinary hands with no expectation that they themselves would live to see its fullness. The Fremen planted their wind traps and dug their catch basins and hoarded their water toward the far-off day. And Paul worked among them at this too, because he had come to love the dream for its own sake. For the way it asked people to labor kindly toward a future they would never enter. There was a deep contentment in this that he could not have named in his younger years on Caladan, when he had been a duke's son with the wide world seemingly owed to him. The Sietch life was hard, and it was small, and it asked everything of a person and returned only enough, and yet, in the asking and returning there, was a fullness that the palaces of Khitain, for all their fountains, could never hold. Paul rose to work he understood, among people he trusted, toward a dream worth carrying, and lay down each night tired in a good way. And that, he came slowly to understand, was very nearly all a life could honestly offer, and it was enough. He had traded the whole vast weight of a possible empire for this, without ever knowing he had made the trade, and the bargain was the best that any man ever struck. The years wore on, and Paul wore with them, as all people do. The desert did not soften for him, but he softened toward it, the way a man softens toward a hard companion he has traveled with for a lifetime. His hands grew rough and sure. His face took the lines of the sun and the wind and the long looking into distances. The young ones he had taught began to teach the younger ones in turn, and the pattern renewed itself. Water into water, work into work, season folding into season without hurry and without end. And through it all, Paul remained what he had chosen so many times to be, not a myth and not a messiah, and not the hinge of history, but a man of the Sietch, growing old among his people, keeping faith with the near and the small, carrying his share of the endless patient labor of living, and finding in that labor a peace so deep and so quiet that no legend could ever have touched it. Up next in chapter 17, the cost of being no one special will weigh with a gentle hand what is lost and what is gained by never being chosen. The power over time set against the vast weight of blood, and rest a while in the quiet honesty of that trade. Chapter 17. The cost of being no one special. There is a kind of accounting that no ledger in the Imperium was ever built to hold, and it is the accounting of a life that might have been vast and chose instead to be small. Paul Atreides came to understand this accounting slowly, over many quiet years in the deep desert, and he never spoke of it aloud, for it was not the sort of thing that words could carry without breaking. He simply carried it in himself, the way a man carries the memory of a road he did not take, and on the long, still nights when the siege had gone to sleep around him, he would sometimes sit awake and turn the reckoning over, gently, the way one turns a smooth stone found in a dry riverbed. He knew what he had refused. He had felt the edge of it once, standing before the changed water, and he had understood in that moment that a door stood open before him, and that beyond the door lay something enormous. Beyond the door lay time itself, unrolled like a great carpet, past and future spread flat, so that a single eye might read them together. Beyond the door lay the power to see the shapes of things before they arrived, to move through the years without the blindness that binds every other living soul. And beyond the door, folded into that same terrible gift, lay the throne and the banner and the ocean of consequence that would have followed a man who could not be surprised. He had turned away from the door, and it had closed, and it had stayed closed, and now on these still nights he weighed what closing it had cost him. The first cost was knowledge, and it was a real cost, and he did not pretend otherwise. Every man who has ever lived has wished, at least once, to know how a thing would end before he began it. Paul lived without that mercy entirely. He did not know which of his choices would flower and which would wither. He did not know, when he sent a friend out across the sand, whether that friend would return. He did not know the day of his own death, nor the manner of it, nor whether the people he loved would outlast him or fall before him. He lived as every ordinary person lives, feeling his way forward through a darkness that gave up its secrets only one heartbeat at a time. There were nights when this blindness pressed on him like a weight, and he would have given a great deal in those weak hours for a single clear glimpse of the road ahead. But he had come to see that the blindness was not only a cost, it was also, strangely, a gift wearing the mask of a loss, and this was the part of the accounting that took him the longest to learn. A man who cannot see the future must live inside the present, because the present is the only country he has been given. He must taste his water while it is in his mouth, because he cannot taste tomorrow's. He must love the people beside him tonight, because he has not been shown whether they will be beside him at dawn. Paul found that his refusal of prescience had pressed him down into his own days, into their grit and their warmth and their ordinary passing, and that pressing down was itself a kind of wealth. He was awake in his own life in a way that a seer, forever half living in years not yet arrived, could never quite be. The second cost was scale. Had he walked through the door, whole worlds would have turned toward him. Legions would have carried his name across the dark between the stars. Planets would have been shaped by a word from his mouth, and histories would have bent around him like light around a heavy thing. He would have mattered in the great cold arithmetic of the galaxy, more than any single human being had mattered in 10,000 years. Instead, he mattered to a siege. He mattered to a woman, and to a handful of children, and to the men who worked the spice beside him, and to the old ones who remembered his face from the year he first came stumbling out of the sand. His whole reach in the universe could have been measured in the distance a voice carries across a cavern. This was a smallness so complete that a lesser man might have mourned it. Paul did not mourn it. He weighed it against the other side of the ledger, and the other side of the ledger was written in blood he had not spilled. For folded into that vast mattering, that galaxy turned toward one man, there had been a river of death. He had felt its shape at the edge of the closed door, the way one feels heat from a fire in the next room. Uncounted billions, falling under a banner that carried his name, in wars fought in his honor by people who had never seen his face and never would. The Great Mattering and the Great Dying had been the same thing, two faces of the one enormous coin, and a man could not have taken the one without minting the other. By staying small, Paul had kept his hands clean of an ocean of graves. This was the heaviest weight on the good side of the scale, and it never grew light. Every child who laughed in the CH corridors was, in a way he alone understood, a child who had not been thrown into a fire he might have lit. So the accounting balanced strangely. On one side, no power over time, no vast reach, no name carried among the stars, a life that the wide Imperium would never notice and never record. On the other side, a present fully lived, a heart fully spent on the few who were near, and hands that had turned aside from a slaughter so great it could scarcely be imagined. It was not the kind of trade that a young man dreams of when he dreams of glory. It was the kind of trade that only makes sense from inside a long life, looked back upon when the fever of ambition has cooled and a man can see plainly what glory actually costs and what quiet actually buys. There were still the weak hours. Paul was honest enough with himself never to deny them. On certain nights, the smallness of his life would rise up and look at him with a stranger's eyes, and a thin voice in him would ask whether he had been a coward, whether he had hidden from a burden that was rightfully his, whether the door had been not a temptation but a duty he had failed. He let the voice speak on those nights because he had learned that silencing it only gave it strength. He let it ask its hard question all the way to the end. And then, most nights, he found that the answer was still the same. He would rather be the man who kept his hands empty than the God who filled them with the world. He would rise from those long thoughts before the first light and go to the sleeping shape of Chani and listen to her breathing and feel the plain enormous fact that she was there, alive, tonight. The great door stayed closed behind him in the dark, and he did not look back at it. He had made his trade. He would go on making it, one ordinary day at a time, for as long as the desert allowed him to. Up next in Chapter 18, The Desert's Quiet Reward, will follow the slow, deep contentment that grew in a life measured not in conquered worlds, but in water shared and family kept. The small, hard-won peace that no legend could ever have known. Chapter 18, The Desert's Quiet Reward. If you had asked the Fremen of that siege what wealth was, they would not have shown you spice, though spice was the treasure that the whole Imperium bled itself dry to gather. They would have shown you water. On Arrakis, water was the true coin, the measure of a life, the thing that a man was born owing and spent his years trying to keep. And in the long, slow accounting of the years, Paul Atreides grew rich in the only wealth the desert recognized, which was not the water hoarded in a private store, but the water shared, given, poured out, and returned, moving between people like warmth between hands cupped around a small fire. His reward was slow. That was the first thing to understand about it. It did not arrive in a single blazing hour, the way glory arrives for the men in the stories. It gathered the way a dune gathers, one grain of sand laid quietly upon another, until one day a man looks up and finds that a whole shape has risen, where before there was only flatness. And he cannot name the moment it happened, because there was no moment, only the patient adding of days. So it was with the peace that grew in Paul over the years. He could not have told anyone the night it began. He only knew that at some point along the way, the ache of what he had refused had softened into something else, and that the something else was contentment, and that contentment had a taste as clean as water drawn from the deepest catch. Consider what filled his ordinary days, for the reward was hidden inside the ordinary and could be found nowhere else. There was the morning work, the going out with the other men to tend the traps and the seals, and the slow, patient business of survival. There was the shared labor over the spice, backs bent in the same rhythm, no man above another, each one trusting the others to watch the sand for the thunder of a worm. There was the return in the deep of the day to the cool of the caverns, and the smell of the sietch, and the sound of children somewhere down a corridor, and the knowledge that he belonged to this place now as fully as any man born to it. He had earned that belonging with his hands over years, and a thing earned with the hands sits differently in the chest than a thing given by prophecy. It cannot be taken back, because no one gave it. He made it himself. There was the water discipline, and in it Paul found a strange, gentle joy that he could never have explained to a man of Kytaen or Caledon. To the soft worlds, thrift with water would have seemed a poverty, a grinding meanness of life. To the Fremen it was reverence. Every drop was counted because every drop was holy, and to count a thing is, in the end, to love it. Paul learned to love water the way the desert taught, which is to say completely, with his whole attention, letting nothing be wasted and nothing be taken for granted. And a man who has learned to treasure water learns, without meaning to treasure everything else the same way. The touch of a hand. The evening rest. The particular light of Arrakis at the closing of the day, when the sky went the color of old brass and the heat lifted off the sand and the whole world seemed to exhale. He had 1,000 of these small treasures, and a legend would have been too busy being a legend to notice a single one of them. And there was the family. This was the heart of the reward, the still center around which the rest of his contentment turned. Chani beside him through the seasons, her strength woven into his own, until he could no longer have said where one left off and the other began. The children who came and grew and filled the corridors with their quick feet and their questions, and who looked at Paul not as a figure out of prophecy, but simply as a father, which was a thing worth more to him than any title the Imperium could have hung around his neck. To be a father, plainly, to a child who has no idea that her father once stood at the edge of godhood and stepped back, is to be given a gift so ordinary that most men never see how enormous it is. Paul saw it. He had weighed against the throne, and it had outweighed the throne, and he never once doubted the scale. The peace was hard won. That word matters, for the desert never gave anything softly, and Paul's contentment was not the easy comfort of a man who had never suffered. He had lost his father to treachery. He had fled across the sand with nothing. He had buried friends in the way of the Fremen, giving their water back to the tribe. And he had felt the particular grief that comes when the desert takes someone before their time. His peace was not built on the absence of pain. It was built on the far side of pain. The way a green thing grows in the shelter of a rock that has been split by the very sun it now shades against. He had passed through the hard years, and what he had on the other side of them was not innocence, but something better and rarer, which was a peace that knew exactly what it had cost and treasured itself accordingly. He thought sometimes of the greening dream, the slow, patient work of turning the desert kinder that the planetologist had planted in Fremen hearts before Paul ever came. He had joined that work with his own hands, tending the hidden plantings, carrying water to the buried gardens, believing in a transformation that he knew he would not live to see completed. This too was a quiet reward, and a peculiar one, for it asked a man to labor for a harvest that would ripen long after he was dust. To plant a thing you will never see flower is to make peace with your own smallness in the flow of time. To accept that you are one hand among many hands across many generations, and to find that acceptance not bitter, but sweet. Paul planted and did not need to see the flowering, and that not needing was itself a sign of how far his contentment had grown. On the good evenings, and there were many good evenings across those years, Paul would sit at the mouth of a high cavern as the light failed, with Chani near and the sounds of the siege settling behind him. And he would feel the whole shape of his life resting quietly in him like water held level in a cupped hand. He had not conquered anything. No world remembered his name. The great Imperium turned on out among the stars, indifferent, never having heard of him. And none of that touched the thing he held. He had water shared, and family kept, and a small, hard-won peace. And he had come to understand, in the long, patient teaching of the desert, that these were not the consolation prizes of a life that had missed its greatness. They were the greatness. They had been the greatness all along, and only a man who had turned down the other kind could see it so clearly. Up next in Chapter 19, An Ordinary Death Far Off, we'll take the long, gentle view of a full human life drawing toward its close. A man grown old in the siege, honored by his people not as a god, but as a good man who stayed. Chapter 19. An Ordinary Death Far Off. Death on Arrakis was never a stranger. The desert kept it close, in the heat and the thirst and the great worms and the long knife-edged history of the tribes, and the Fremen did not flinch from it the way the soft worlds flinched. They had a discipline for it, as they had a discipline for water, and indeed the two disciplines were the same. For when a Fremen died, his body was given to the death stills, and his water was returned to the tribe, so that even in dying a person went on giving. Death was not an ending among them so much as a passing of water from one keeping to another. And so, when we come at last to speak of Paul Atreides growing old and reaching the far edge of his days, we speak of it in the desert's own way. Without fear, slowly, the way one lowers a heavy thing gently to the ground. He grew old. This was itself a kind of small miracle on a world that took so many before their time. Many of the men he had come up beside were long gone into the tribe's water before Paul's own hair went silver, and he outlived friends and rivals, and more than one of the old ones who had watched him stumble in from the sand as a young fugitive. To grow old on Arrakis was to be spared again and again from 100 hard deaths, and Paul knew this and did not take a single one of his added years as owed to him. Each one was a gift he had not been promised. He had lived without prescience his whole life long, never knowing which day would be his last, and so every morning that the light found him still breathing was a morning that arrived as a surprise and was received as one. The aging came the way aging comes to any man, and there was a plainness in it that Paul found he welcomed. His hands, that had worked the spice and held the crysknife and cupped the faces of his children, grew slow and knotted. His back, that had carried water across the sand for the buried gardens, bent a little more each year. His eyes, still the deep blue of a lifetime steeped in spice, dimmed toward the edges, so that the far dunes blurred into the sky. He did not rage against any of it. He had made a long peace with time by refusing to master it, and now that time was doing to him what it does to every living thing, he met it as an old companion rather than an enemy. He had been ordinary all his life on purpose, and there is nothing more ordinary nor more universal than to grow old and to feel the body loosen its grip, and Paul went into this last common human country the way he had gone into all the others, without complaint, one step at a time. The siege honored him as he aged, and the shape of that honor is worth dwelling on, for it was not the honor a god receives. No one knelt to him. No one carried his name as a banner into battle. No one built him a shrine or wrote his sayings into a book to be recited by strangers who would never know his face. The honor Paul received was the honor a community gives to one of its own who has stayed the whole distance, and it was made of small things, which are the only true things. The young ones came to him with their troubles because he had seen so many seasons that little could surprise him anymore. The old ones sat with him in the cool of the caverns and remembered together the years they had shared. His counsel was asked, and weighed, and often followed, not because prophecy backed it, but because a long life of good judgment had earned it a hearing. He was honored, in short, as a good man who had stayed, and if you had told him as a boy that this was the height a life could reach, he might not have believed you, but as an old man, he knew it was true. He watched his children become adults, and then watched their children come into the corridors in their turn, and this was perhaps the deepest of the ordinary rewards that his ordinary length of days brought him. To see the next generation, and the one after, to hold a grandchild, and know that the thread of his life ran on into people who would carry it forward after he was gone, was a form of continuance that had nothing of prophecy in it, and needed nothing of prophecy. He would not see the future, he had never seen the future, but he could see it in a different and humbler way now, in these young faces that carried something of his own and Chani's, and that was enough. It had always been enough. That had been the whole quiet lesson of his life. Chani, she walked with him through the long decline of the years, as she had walked with him through everything, and the two of them grew old together in the desert, the way two trees grow old that have stood so long side by side that their roots have grown together underground. Whether she went before him into the tribe's water, or he before her, is a thing the desert keeps to itself. For these are not tales of great deaths marked by armies and eclipses. They are the plain passings of two desert people who had loved each other a whole life long, and such passings happen quietly, in the cool of a cavern, with the near ones present and the far Imperium never knowing and never caring. When the grief came, and it came, it was met with the water discipline, and honored, and carried, and folded into the going on of the tribe, as all grief was. And Paul, at the last of his long days, was a man far off from everything the wide galaxy called important. Kaitain did not know his name. No historian recorded his death. The great houses turned their intrigues without the smallest ripple from a silver-haired old man dying in a cave on a world they thought of, if they thought of it at all, only as a source of the spice. He was, by every measure the Imperium used, no one at all, a single unrecorded human life closing on a hard little planet at the edge of things. And by the only measures that had ever mattered to Paul, he was a man complete. He had loved and been loved. He had worked and been useful. He had kept his hands clean of the ocean of blood that the other path would have spilled. He had grown old among people who honored him as one of their own. He had lived the whole length of a human life, all the way to the far end of it, and he had lived it as himself. There is a particular peace that settles over a life seen whole at its close, when nothing more needs to be done, and nothing more needs to be proven, when a man can lie back into the long view of all his years and find that the shape of them is good. That peace came to Paul Atreides in the end, far off from empire, deep in the desert that had made him, and it asked nothing more of him than that he rest. Up next in Chapter 20, the sleeper who was simply a man will come to the very close of it all, the rest at the end, the desert wind, the stars wheeling over Arrakis, and a human story small and whole folding softly shut under the open sky. Chapter 20. The sleeper who was simply a man. And so we come, gently, to the end of it. Not the end of an empire, for there was no empire. Not the end of a prophecy, for there was no prophecy. Only the end of a man, one man, who had been given the chance to become something vast and had chosen, again and again through a whole quiet life, to remain only himself. There is no thunder in an ending like this, and there is not meant to be. It closes the way the desert closes over a set of footprints, softly, patiently, with the wind doing the work, until the sand lies smooth again and holds no trace of the passing, except in the keeping of those who saw it happen. Picture the desert at the last, for the desert is where this story has always lived, and where it must set itself down to rest. Picture Arrakis in the deep of the night, the great open sand cooling under a sky scrubbed clean of everything but stars. There is no world in all the Imperium with a sky like the desert sky, for there is no world so empty of soft light to drown the far fires out. The stars over Arrakis burned close and countless, a whole slow wheel of them turning through the long hours of the dark. And beneath that wheel the dunes lay silver and still, ridge after ridge, running out to a horizon that a man could never quite reach, no matter how many years he walked toward it. This was the country that had received Paul Atreides as a frightened fugitive with nothing, and had asked everything of him, and had, in its hard way, given everything back. The wind moved over the sand the way it had moved for longer than any people had lived on that world. Before the Fremen, before the spice hunters, before the first ship ever fell out of the sky toward the dunes. It carried the fine grains along in low whispering sheets, and it smelled faintly of the spice as the desert wind always did, and it passed over the mouths of the sea edges where the people slept in the safety of the deep rock. It did not know that a man had lived and died. The wind never knows. It simply goes on, patient and blind and endless, and there is a great comfort in that going on. For it means that the world holds its shape, whether or not any single one of us is there to see it, and that when we set our burdens down the desert, we'll keep turning gently over them, and the stars will keep their slow wheel, and the long night will hold everything softly until the morning comes. He rested now. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, for it had always been enough. The man who might have swallowed time whole, who might have moved worlds and drowned the stars in a war carried under his name, had asked in the end for nothing more than what the least and plainest of us are given, which is rest at the close of a day's work, sleep at the end of a life fully lived. He had spent his years awake in them, present in each one, refusing to trade the warm certain now for the cold vast maybe of a future no man was meant to hold. And a life spent so fully awake earns, at its close, a sleep as deep and clean as the water at the bottom of the oldest ketch. He had earned his rest the honest way, the ordinary way, the only way that leaves a man easy at the end. And now he had it. Think of what he carried down into that rest, and think of what he did not. He did not carry the weight of billions dead beneath his banner, for he had never raised a banner. He did not carry the terrible loneliness of the seer, forever set apart from other people by knowing too much of what would come. He did not carry a throne, or a crown, or the endless watchful fear of the powerful who can never again trust a single soul around them. He carried, instead, the memory of a woman's hand in his through a long shared life. He carried the sound of his children in the corridors. He carried the taste of shared water and the feel of good work done beside good people, and the particular brass-colored light of 1,000 desert evenings. He carried a life small enough to hold and whole enough to be at peace with, and he set it down at the last as lightly as a man sets down a thing he has loved and is ready, now, to release. His people kept him in the way of the desert, and his water went back to the tribe, and the tribe went on. The children grew, and had children, and the buried gardens that Paul had helped to water went on greening in their hidden places. Slowly, patiently toward a kinder Arrakis that he had labored for and never needed to see. The greening dream ran on in ordinary hands, as it always had, unhurried, unheralded, carried forward by people whose names the Imperium would never learn. And out among the far stars, the great houses turned their intrigues, and the Emperor sat his throne undisturbed, and the whole vast indifferent machine of empire ground on exactly as it would have if a certain boy on a certain desert world had never been born at all. None of it had bent around him. He had made sure of that. He had chosen to leave the world unbent, and the world, in its turn, let him go without a ripple. And there was a deep rightness in that quiet exchange that only the desert could have taught. This was a human story. That is what it was, from the first breath of it to the last, and that is why it closes so softly. It was not the story of a god, or a chosen one, or a savior come to break the wheel of history. It was the story of a man who could have been all those things and chose instead to be a man, and who found, in that choosing, more than any of those greater things could ever have given him. It was small and it was whole, and the two went together, for the smallness was what let it be whole. A life that reaches for everything can never be complete, because there is always more to seize. A life that reaches only for what a man can truly hold in his two hands can be filled to the brim and set down full. Paul's was set down full. There was nothing left unfinished in it, nothing grasping, nothing owed. It was complete the way a circle is complete, gently closed, resting in itself. And so the desert holds him now, and the wind goes on over the sand, and the stars wheel slow and bright above a world that will one day be green. Somewhere in the deep rock the people sleep, safe and breathing, and the story of the man who stayed sleeps with them, folded quietly into the long memory of the tribe. There is nothing more that needs to be done tonight. There is nothing more to reach for, nothing more to fear, nothing left but the soft turning of the world and the deep clean rest at the end of a life well lived. Let it close here, under the open sky, with the wind low and the stars turning, and the whole human story of Paul Atreides drawn gently to a peaceful sleep at last. Rest now. All is quiet. All is well. The desert keeps its own, softly, and the night holds us all. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we followed a boy without a prophecy, and a design quietly undone. An ordinary boyhood on Caladan, and an arrival on Arrakis with no Messiah's shadow to fall across it. We watched the fall still come and be survived. A desert with no legend waiting in it. A young man becoming simply a Fremen among Fremen, and the strange freedom of nights with no visions in them. We saw the water of life refused. A man who chose not to become a myth, the simple work of spice and survival, and a love with Chani that asked for no empire. We followed a reckoning with the Harkonnen fought as men and not as holy war. A jihad that never crossed the stars. An emperor left untroubled. Long seasons of siege life, and the quiet reward of an ordinary path, until a long life closed gently far away, and the sleeper who was only ever a man came at last to rest. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those bright and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like heat shimmer fading from the evening dunes. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.